thick mist rolls off the dark surface of the Ohio River, swallowing the massive wooden flatboat as it drifts through the 1790s wilderness. The scent of wet timber and river mud fills the cold dawn air. Welcome to Unwritten Axiom. I am glad you are here. If these quiet histories bring you comfort, you are always welcome to return by subscribing. Shadows stretch across the deck of the flatboat, an unwieldy wooden box designed to flow downstream with the sluggish current. No wind stirs the heavy canopy of oak and hickory lining the muddy banks. The silence holds a specific weight, broken only by the steady lap of water against the broad oak hull. This is the edge of the known nation, a place where maps grow vague and the law fades into rumor. The world exists as a narrow channel of gray water, cutting through an endless wall of ancient forest. You stand at the rear steering sweep, your raw hands gripping the frost-rimed wood of the long pole. The cold bites straight through your wool coat, settling into the joints of your shoulders after hours of tense navigation. You watch the dark shapes of driftwood slip past the hull, knowing any submerged snag could shatter the heavy planks beneath your boots. The river demands your unbroken attention, a relentless force pulling you south toward the distant markets of New Orleans. You shift your stance on the damp deck, bracing against the subtle shifts in the current that travel up the sweep oar and into your bones. You breathe out a small cloud of white vapor that hangs in the still air before dissolving into the river mist. Your eyes scan the eastern tree line, searching for the first break of morning light to burn away the chill. The cargo holds below are packed tight with barrels of salt pork, flour from Pittsburgh, and iron tools bound for new settlements. You feel the immense responsibility of that cargo, a small fortune in trade goods riding on a fragile wooden raft. You pull the rough collar of your coat higher against your neck, letting the familiar rhythm of the river steady your racing thoughts. Pale morning approaches with agonizing slowness, painting the high clouds in muted shades of bruised purple and dull iron. The flatboat creaks in protest as it catches a minor eddy, the heavy timbers groaning against the iron spikes holding them together. A lone heron takes flight from a sandbar ahead, its massive wings beating a hollow rhythm against the fog. The isolation of the frontier wraps around the vessel like a physical garment. No other human settlement lies within a week's hard journey, leaving the crew isolated in the vast expanse of the Ohio Valley. You listen to the sleeping men below deck, their even breathing offering a small comfort against the vastness of the morning. You step carefully along the starboard edge, testing the tension of the side sweeps secured with heavy hemp rope. The damp wood of the deck is treacherous, slick with overnight frost that has yet to melt. You trace the line of the riverbank, looking for the telltale signs of hidden shoals or treacherous gravel bars. You know this water is unforgiving, demanding a terrible price for a single moment of lost focus. You reach into your pocket and turn a small, smooth river stone over in your palm, a nervous habit acquired over miles of silent floating. The tension in your jaw eases slightly as the sky lightens to a pale, washed-out blue. You notice the mist beginning to thin near the center channel, revealing the true width of the massive waterway carrying you forward. You guide the heavy sweep oar with a practiced push, keeping the clumsy square nose of the flatboat pointed downstream. You find a strange peace in the repetitive labor, a physical connection to the landscape that quiets the anxieties of the journey. Smoke from a small cooking fire in the forward box begins to drift backward across the deck. The scent of burning hickory mixes with the sharp tang of the river, signaling the start of the crew's waking hours. A heavy iron skillet clatters against a stone harp, the sound unnaturally loud in the hushed environment. The men move with stiff, reluctant grace, their muscles sore from days of maneuvering the massive raft through treacherous bends. Breakfast will be hardtack and salted meat, the unvarying diet of men who work the western rivers. You hand the steering sweep to an older crewman, his face weathered into deep creases by decades of sun and wind. You walk toward the firebox, the heat rolling off the small iron stove offering a brief respite from the biting cold. You hold your numb hands over the crackling flames, feeling the sting of returning circulation in your fingertips. You observe the sparks rise and vanish into the lightning sky-brief pinpricks of light swallowed by the dawn. You accept a dented tin cup of boiling chicory coffee, the bitter liquid burning pleasantly down your throat. You settle onto a wooden crate near the fire, letting the warmth soak into your damp trousers. You cast your gaze toward the dense shoreline again, the warnings of tavern keepers and merchants echoing in your mind. You have heard the dark rumors of the Harkbay brothers, violent men who haunt these isolated stretches of the Ohio looking for vulnerable boats. You grip the handle of the hunting knife at your belt, an unconscious gesture of reassurance in a lawless territory. You force the dark thoughts away, focusing instead on the practical mechanics of the morning meal and the day's upcoming labor. Golden light finally breaches the tree line, casting long, illuminating shafts across the muddy water. The river changes character in the daylight, shifting from a dark menace to a vast, shimmering highway of commerce and risk. Giant sycamore trees lean precariously over the banks, their white bark glowing like bone against the darker greens of the forest. The current accelerates slightly as the river narrows between two high bluffs. The flatboat rides lower in the water, heavy with the commerce that drives the expansion of the young nation. You finish your bitter coffee and set the tin cup carefully on the wooden deck. You move back to the side sweeps, joining two other men to guide the heavy raft away from a dangerous tangle of fallen trees known as a sawyer. You push against the thick wooden pole with your entire body weight, the rough bark tearing at the calluses on your palms. You hear the water churning angrily around the submerged branches just yards from the hull. You coordinate your movements with the others, finding a silent rhythm born of shared necessity and mutual survival. You feel the heavy boat respond sluggishly to the combined effort, inching away from the fatal trap. You wipe the cold sweat from your forehead with the back of a dirty sleeve, your heart hammering against your ribs. You step back as the danger passes, the flatboat slipping safely into the deeper, faster water of the main channel. You exchange a grim nod with the older steersman, no words needed to acknowledge the narrow escape. You realize that out here, death is not a dramatic event, but a simple miscalculation of current and timber. Cold wind brings a steady bite from the north, cutting through the sparse warmth of the pale sun. The surface of the river chops into small, agitated waves that slap relentlessly against the flatboat's square bow. Farther downstream, the notorious cave-in rock waits in the limestone bluffs, a natural fortress where outlaws like Samuel Mason reportedly lure unwary travelers. The river network is a vital artery for the continent, but it is also a hunting ground for those who prey on the isolated and the vulnerable. The men on the boat know that safety lies only in constant vigilance, and the heavy loaded muskets kept dry below decks. You walk the length of the deck, inspecting the thick ropes lashing the cargo crates together. You pull hard on a hemp knot, ensuring the heavy barrels of salt pork have not shifted during the rough navigation. You spot a small leak near the port bow, a slow, steady weep of river water seeping between two rough-hewn planks. You retrieve a wooden bucket and a long-handled mallet from the tool chest, your mind shifting to the immediate problem of maintenance. You kneel on the wet wood, driving oakum into the seam with heavy, measured strikes to seal the breach. You swing the mallet with a steady, metronomic cadence, the sound echoing flatly across the open water. You check the dark oakum fibers wedging tight against the pressure of the river, stopping the slow intrusion of the water. You stand and stretch the ache from your lower back, your muscles stiffening in the cold wind. You look at the distant shoreline, where the thick forest gives way to a sprawling expanse of marshland. You imagine the vast, untamed continent stretching out for unmapped miles in every direction, indifferent to your small struggles on the wooden raft. Trade goods represent months of labor, a collective gamble by the merchants of Pittsburgh to turn Eastern manufacturing into Southern silver. A flatboat is a one-way vessel, built to be dismantled and sold for scrap lumber once it reaches the markets of New Orleans. The journey takes weeks of unceasing labor, floating through territory where the nearest magistrate is hundreds of miles away. Every bend in the river presents a new equation of risk, from submerged snags to sudden shoals to the unpredictable actions of desperate men. The crew operates under a strict hierarchy of experience, trusting their lives to the man reading the water at the steering sweep. You take your turn at the forward watch, standing near the square bow to look for submerged hazards. You peer through the glare of the morning sun reflecting off the chopped surface of the river. You point silently toward a pale, submerged trunk lying just beneath the waterline, giving the steersman time to adjust the heavy craft's trajectory. You sense a strange solidarity with the men around you, a bond forged not by friendship, but by the sheer necessity of keeping the boat afloat. You draw a slow, deep breath of the sharp river air, tasting the complex metallic tang of the muddy water. You grab a thick woolen blanket from your pack and drape it over your shoulders to break the chill of the northern breeze. You sit on a sturdy wooden crate of iron nails, your eyes never leaving the surface of the river ahead. You count the slow, steady strokes of the side sweeps as the men battle a strong cross-current, trying to push the boat toward a gravel bar. You know that grounding the heavy raft would mean hours of freezing labor in the shallows to lever it free. You wait for the tension to pass, your body primed to move at a moment's notice if the river demands it. Hours wear on, the initial cold of dawn surrendering to a crisp, bright autumn chill. The river begins to widen, the dark lines of the forest retreating slightly to reveal low, muddy banks choked with river cane. A flatboat operates without grace, a heavy, blunt instrument of commerce, forcing its way down the continent's major artery. The men who work these boats are rough-weather tools themselves, shaped by the demands of constant labor and persistent danger. They do not romanticize the frontier, viewing it simply as a hostile environment that must be survived to earn a wage. You track a flock of wild ducks taking flight from the reeds, their wings beating a frantic tattoo against the water before they lift into the pale sky. You follow their flight south, moving in the exact direction the sluggish current is pulling your heavy raft. You test the priming on the flintlock rifle resting against the cargo box, running your thumb over the cold iron of the hammer. You are not a violent man by nature, but the reality of the 1790s frontier requires a willingness to defend your life and your livelihood without hesitation. You return the weapon back to its place, hoping the day passes with only the river to fight. You join the men at the side sweeps for another rotation, taking the heavy wooden pole in your blistered hands. You fall into the grueling rhythm, pushing forward with your legs and leaning your upper body into the immense weight of the water. You endure the strain in your calves and the sharp burn in your forearms, the physical cost of moving tons of cargo down an unyielding river. You glance at the water swirling away from the blade of the sweep, a hypnotic spiral of mud and foam. You let your mind go blank, surrendering to the mechanical requirements of the labor. Midday approaches as the sun climbs higher, approaching the zenith and signaling the slow transition from morning. The river straightens, offering a long, clear view of the water ahead, empty of other boats or obvious hazards. The constant creak of the timber and the rhythmic splash of the sweeps form a steady, unchanging soundtrack to the journey. This is the truth of the early frontier, long hours of monotonous, back-breaking labor, punctuated by the awareness of hidden threats. The flatboat continues its relentless drift south, a tiny speck of human ambition floating through an immense and uncaring wilderness. You wipe the accumulation of sweat from your brow, feeling the harsh grit of river sand against your skin. The morning chill has vanished, replaced by a heavy, stifling heat that presses down from a cloudless sky. The Ohio River transforms into a blinding mirror of reflected light, forcing you to squint against the relentless glare. Midday on the flatboat brings a different kind of endurance, testing the limits of men already exhausted by the heavy sweeps. The unhurried current pulls the vessel southward, dragging it deeper into a vast expanse of unbroken green. Heat radiates from the rough-hewn deck planks, baking the residual morning dampness into a humid vapor that clings to your clothing. The smell of hot pine resin mixes with the sour odor of unwashed wool and salted pork. Cicadas begin their frantic buzzing, and the dense shoreline foliage or piercing mechanical whine that drowns out the subtle lapping of the water. This is the reality of the frontier economy, where every mile of progress is bought with sweat and blistering discomfort. The massive wooden box offers no shade, leaving the crew entirely exposed to the brutal elements of the river valley. You climb carefully down the short wooden ladder into the cramped cargo hold. The air down here is stifling, trapped beneath the heavy timber ceiling and smelling fiercely of cured meat and damp flour. You press your hands against the massive oak barrels, feeling for any sign of shifting or structural failure that could doom the shipment. These goods are the lifeblood of Western expansion, representing the entire fortune of the men who financed this perilous journey. You check the wooden wedges holding the crates in place, striking them firmly with the heel of your heavy leather boot. You emerge back onto the blazing deck, welcoming the slight breeze that moves across the open water. The older steersman points a calloused finger toward a dark bend in the river ahead, his expression hardening into a mask of tense vigilance. This stretch of water holds a notorious reputation among the rivermen, a prime ambush location for the ruthless predators who stalk the trade routes. Outlaws like Samuel Mason run their violent enterprises just downriver, turning the natural isolation of these bends into a deadly advantage. The economy of river piracy is grim but straightforward, built on stealing cargo worth hundreds or thousands of dollars from trapped merchant vessels. You unholster the heavy flintlock pistol from your belt, checking the powder pan with deliberate, practiced movements. Fear is a tangible presence on the raft now, heavy and metallic. The men stop their casual conversation, their eyes scanning the tangled roots and overhanging branches of the approaching riverbank. Every shadow looks like a hidden skiff. Every snapped twig sounds like a musket hammer pulling back. The flatboat is a sitting duck, a cumbersome vault of wealth completely at the mercy of the river's geography. The current sweeps the clumsy vessel closer to the eastern shore, drawing it dangerously near the dense vegetation. You step to the port rail, resting your weapon on the top timber. Your heart hammers a frantic rhythm against your ribs as the boat drifts into the shadow of the towering bluffs. The air cools instantly in this shaded canyon, raising goosebumps on your sweat-slicked arms. You watch a turtle slide silently off a half-submerged log, the tiny splash making you flinch. The silence of the gorge is unnatural, lacking the usual chatter of birds and insects. You hold your breath as the narrowest point of the passage approaches. The river compresses, forcing the sluggish water into a faster, more turbulent flow that twists the heavy raft sideways. The crew springs into frantic action, driving the long wooden sweeps into the churning water to correct the dangerous drift. You grab a spare pole and throw your weight against it, your boots slipping slightly on the damp deck. The effort tears a grunt from your throat, the wood bowing under the combined force of desperate men fighting the current. Wood groans in loud protest against the competing forces of muscle and moving water. The blunt bow of the vessel scrapes against the hidden gravel bar, sending a shuddering vibration through the entire structure. For a terrifying second, the forward momentum stops, the river piling up against the stern and threatening to push the boat over. Then, with a harsh grating sound, the hull breaks free and surges forward into the deeper channel. The immediate physical danger passes, but the threat of an ambush remains a cold weight in the back of the mind. You scan the high limestone bluffs looking for any glint of metal or movement among the rocks. Cave-in rock lies miles ahead, a natural fortress where bandits pose as friendly travelers to lure boats into shelter before robbing them. But opportunistic killers do not always wait for the established strongholds. The Harpe brothers, those infamous men who kill with an absent-minded malice, could be watching from any forested ridge. The sheer unpredictability of the danger creates a cultural anxiety that haunts every man working these wooden rafts. You tighten your grip on the pistol, determined not to be taken by surprise in this desolate canyon. You let out a long exhale as the bluffs gradually recede, the river widening once more into a sunlit expanse. The tension leaves the crew in a collective sigh, shoulders dropping and grips loosening on the heavy oars. The passage was safe this time, a minor victory in a journey that requires dozens of them to reach the southern markets. You return your pistol to your belt, the iron warm against your side. The afternoon sun begins its long descent, changing the angle of the harsh light. Hunger asserts itself with a dull ache in the belly. The cook distributes the midday ration, passing around thick chunks of dense cornbread and strips of heavily salted pork. There is no time to light the fire or stop the boat, so the men eat while standing at their posts. The food is tough and requires serious chewing, tasting of ash and brine. It is sustenance stripped of all pleasure, fuel designed only to keep bodies moving through grueling labor. You take a bite of the dry bread, washing it down with a pull from a wooden canteen. The water is tepid and tastes strongly of the oak barrel, but it soothes your parched throat. You watch the shoreline slip past, the endless procession of trees becoming a hypnotic blur of green and brown. You try to imagine the vastness of this continent, the thousands of miles of unmapped territory stretching westward. It makes your own existence feel insignificant. A tiny moat floating on a massive ribbon of water. You notice a change in the wind, a slight shift bringing the scent of distant rain. The humidity thickens, making the air feel heavy and difficult to breathe in the late afternoon heat. You look toward the southern horizon, spotting the dark, bruised bellies of building thunderheads. A storm on the open river presents a new set of logistical nightmares, threatening to swamp the low-riding flatboat. You alert the steersman, pointing toward the gathering clouds with a sense of grim resignation. Preparation becomes the singular focus of the crew. Heavy canvas tarps are hauled from the storage lockers and dragged across the open cargo holds. Thick ropes are uncoiled and pulled taut, securing the protective coverings against the coming winds. The chaotic scramble replaces the monotonous rhythm of the drift. Every man knows that wet flour is ruined flour, and ruined cargo means a journey made for nothing. You pull a thick hemp line tight, wrapping it around a sturdy iron cleat. Your knuckles ache from the strain, the rough fibers of the rope biting into your skin. You feel the first heavy drop of rain strike your shoulder, cold and startling against your overheated skin. The sky darkens rapidly, the bright afternoon light choked off by the advancing storm front. You secure the final knot just as the wind arrives in a sudden howling rush. You brace your legs against the deck as the flatboat pitches violently in the rising chop. The river, previously a smooth mirror, transforms into a chaotic landscape of whitecaps and surging swells. You grab the port side sweep, joining two other men to keep the unwieldy craft from spinning out of control. The rain begins to fall in blinding sheets, stinging your face and instantly soaking through your heavy wool coat. You lean into the storm, the physical exertion the only thing keeping you warm in the sudden chill. Thunder rolls across the valley in a deafening crack that vibrates in the chest. Lightning illuminates the gray deluge with stark blue-white flashes, revealing the frantic struggle of the crew. The flatboat is a miserable place during a downpour, offering no shelter and demanding agonizing labor just to maintain a straight line. Water streams across the deck, turning the raw planks into a treacherous skating rink. The river is wild now, a churning force trying to crush the wooden intruder. You shout instructions to the man beside you, but the wind tears the words from your mouth. You rely on instinct and muscle memory, reading the push of the current through the vibration of the wooden pole. You slip on the wet deck, your knees slamming hard into the unyielding timber, but you do not release your grip on the sweep. Pain flares sharp and hot, but you ignore it, pushing yourself back upright. Survival in the 1790s wilderness leaves no room for hesitation or weakness. You endure the relentless assault of the weather for what feels like hours. The storm eventually breaks, the heavy rain tapering off into a persistent drizzle. The wind dies down, leaving the river agitated but manageable. You stand panting at the rail, your clothes plastered to your skin, water dripping from the brim of your hat. You look around at the other men, seeing your own exhaustion mirrored in their drawn, wet faces. Late afternoon establishes itself with a pale, washed-out light filtering through the breaking clouds. The flatboat survived the squall intact, the canvas tarps holding fast over the precious cargo. The air smells clean and sharp, the oppressive humidity washed away by the storm. The current remains swift, carrying the vessel further into the deep frontier. The day's labor has been punishing, a testament to the brutal realities of river commerce. You walk over to the small iron stove, finding the fire completely extinguished by the deluge. You gather dry kindling from a protected box, your hands shaking slightly from the cold and the adrenaline crash. You strike flint against steel, coaxing a spark into a tiny nest of dry moss. You nurture the fragile flame, feeding it small twigs until it grows into a crackling fire. You hold your hands over the heat, the warmth returning feeling to your numbed fingers as the afternoon fades into dusk. You watch the last bruised purple light bleed out of the western sky, leaving the river valley wrapped in deepening charcoal shadows. The transition from day to night on the frontier happens with a swift, unforgiving finality that alters the visual landscape. Giant sycamores along the muddy banks transform into towering, skeletal silhouettes, reaching over the dark water with grasping wooden fingers. You feel the temperature drop as the sun dips below the bluffs, the damp chill of the river seeping back into your drying clothes. The flatboat glides silently through the heavy twilight, its massive wooden bulk seeking a safe harbor before absolute darkness claims the Ohio River. This is the most dangerous hour of the journey, when visibility fails, but the water continues its relentless, uncaring pull toward the south. You signal to the older steersman, gesturing toward a small, sheltered inlet carved into the eastern bank by an ancient flood. The heavy side sweeps dip into the ink-black water one last time, fighting the sluggish current to angle the clumsy raft toward the muddy shore. You step to the port rail with a thick coil of hemp rope, your boots finding careful purchase on the damp, uneven deck planks. The sound of crickets and tree frogs begins to swell in the dense underbrush, a chaotic symphony that somehow makes the isolation feel even more vast. You leap from the wooden gunwale into the shallow water, the cold river instantly breaching the tops of your leather boots and soaking your wool trousers. The shock of the icy water forces a sharp gasp from your lungs, but you wade forward through the grasping mud to reach a sturdy willow trunk. You wrap the heavy, abrasive rope around the rough bark of the willow, pulling the slack tight against the immense weight of the drifting flatboat. The wood of the hull groans loudly as it settles against a submerged gravel bar. The physical journey pausing as the current pushes against the stern. You secure the line with a series of complex, practiced knots, testing the tension with your own body weight to ensure the river will not tear the vessel loose before morning. You slog back through the thick, clinging mud to climb aboard, your legs heavy and aching from the sudden exertion. The other men are already moving to tie off the rear starboard post, their dark shapes shifting quietly against the gray backdrop of the fading light. Safety is a temporary illusion bought with thick rope and constant vigilance, a fragile barrier against the vast wilderness surrounding the crew on all sides. The small iron stove in the forward box becomes the focal point of the flatboat's universe as the ambient light fails. Sparks dance upward into the black sky, tiny orange fireflies that vanish before they can reach the overhanging branches of the shoreline trees. A cast-iron Dutch oven is dragged onto the hot coals, the scent of melting pork fat and wild onions quickly overpowering the sharp tang of the river mud. Men gather close to the radiant heat, their faces illuminated in harsh, flickering relief that highlights every deep line of weather-beaten weariness. Conversation remains sparse and muted, hushed tones carrying only the necessary details of the watch schedule and the condition of the cargo. The river commands silence, teaching those who travel its length that noise is an invitation to predators who hunt by sound in the dark. You accept a battered tin plate loaded with a thick, heavy stew of salted meat and hardtack softened by the boiling broth. The heat of the food radiates through the thin metal, warming your raw, blistered hands before the first bite ever reaches your mouth. You sit on a sturdy wooden crate of iron tools, keeping your back to the cargo hold and your eyes fixed on the impenetrable wall of the forest. Every snapped twig in the woods or sudden splash in the water sends a fresh spike of adrenaline through your tense veins. You chew the tough meat slowly, extracting every ounce of salt and sustenance required to rebuild the muscle tissue torn down by the day's brutal labor. The meal offers no culinary delight, functioning solely as fuel to keep a human engine running through another dangerous night on the edge of the nation. You set your empty plate aside and reach for the heavy flintlock rifle leaning against the stacked flour barrels. The smooth, polished walnut stock feels cool and reassuring against your palm, a tangible instrument of survival in an environment governed by ruthless opportunism. You check the flint in the jaws of the hammer, ensuring the sharp edge remains intact and capable of striking a reliable spark. You unstopper a small powder horn and pour a precise measure of black powder into the firing pan. The sulfurous smell sharp and distinct in the humid air. The Hart brothers and their ilk do not operate by rules of engagement, preferring the silent ambush and the overwhelming force of a sudden raid. You wipe down the long iron barrel with an oiled rag, letting the mechanical maintenance calm the anxious racing of your thoughts. Night descends with an oppressive physical weight, erasing the boundaries between the river, the sky, and the towering forest. The only illumination comes from the low pulsing embers of the cookstove and the cold distant scatter of stars visible through a narrow break in the canopy overhead. Water laps relentlessly against the wooden hull, a rhythmic, hypnotic sound that masks the subtle noises of the surrounding wilderness. The flatboat is a floating vault of wealth anchored in a lawless void, holding trade goods that represent months of legitimate labor and an irresistible temptation to those who prefer theft to commerce. The nearest magistrate or courthouse lies hundreds of miles away across unforgiving terrain, leaving the enforcement of justice solely in the hands of the men holding the loaded weapons. The frontier does not forgive a lapse in concentration, making the night watch the most crucial and terrifying duty of the entire journey. You take the first shift of the watch, stepping away from the lingering warmth of the stove to stand at the square bow of the raft. The cold air bites through your damp wool coat, raising goosebumps along your arms and sending a slight shiver down your spine. You force your eyes to adjust to the gloom, scanning the murky surface of the river for the silent, drifting shape of an approaching skiff. You listen past the chaotic chorus of the tree frogs, straining to hear the unnatural sound of an oar lifting from the water or the muffled clink of iron against wood. You know that outlaws like the Harpies leave no survivors to report their crimes, turning every passing shadow into a potential harbinger of sudden, brutal force. You hold the heavy rifle across your chest, your thumb resting lightly on the cold iron hammer, ready to break the silence with a blast of fire if the darkness yields a threat. You pace slowly across the rough deck planks, the subtle friction of your boots, the only sound marking your movement. The isolation presses inward, a vast and indifferent void that reduces your entire world to the 50 feet of floating timber beneath your feet. You look toward the eastern bank, trying to pierce the solid black wall of the forest with sheer visual will. You imagine the countless unmapped miles stretching away from the river, a sprawling continent hiding desperate men who view this waterway as their personal hunting ground. You feel the immense vulnerability of the merchant class on this edge of civilization, carrying fortunes in iron and salt to a gauntlet of organized predation. You stop at the port rail, resting the barrel of the rifle on the wood, and let the cold night air fill your lungs. Shadows seem to detach themselves from the shoreline, playing cool tricks on eyes fatigued by hours of glaring sunlight and relentless vigilance. A massive, waterlogged tree trunk drifts past the anchored flatboat, its twisted roots resembling the grasping arms of a drowning man in the starlight. The sudden, chaotic splash of a large predatory fish hunting in the shallows causes three men to sit up sharply from their bedrolls, their hands instantly seeking the hilts of their knives. The psychological toll of the river journey matches the physical punishment, grinding down the nerves until every unexpected sound registers as a mortal threat. This is the unromantic reality of frontier commerce, a continuous exercise in sustained paranoia required to transport goods from the safety of the East to the lucrative markets of the South. The darkness hides everything, transforming the natural world into a theater of imagined horrors and very real dangers. You lean your weight against the sturdy corner post of the cargo box, trying to relieve the deep, throbbing ache in your lower back. The damp chill of the river has settled permanently into your joints, a stiff reminder of the afternoon's desperate struggle against the sudden squall. You watch the older steersman move silently to the stern, his silhouette merging with the darkness as he checks the tension on the rear mooring lines. You exchange a brief, silent glance with him as he returns, a mutual acknowledgement of the shared burden of keeping the younger men alive until dawn. You pull the collar of your coat up around your neck, burying your chin in the rough wool to trap a meager pocket of body heat. You focus your attention back on the dark water, refusing to lower your guard despite the burning strain in your eyes. You notice a faint, unnatural smell drifting on the sluggish night breeze, a scent distinct from the usual river mud and decaying vegetation. You flare your nostrils, parsing the air to identify the sharp, acrid tang of wood smoke that does not belong to your own dying cookfire. You freeze in place, every muscle in your body tensing as you realize another camp lies somewhere upwind, hidden in the dense timber of the western bank. You step quietly to the steersman, touching his shoulder and pointing a silent finger toward the invisible source of the smoke. You know that river pirates often set up observation camps along these narrow bends, waiting for the current to deliver heavy, unmaneuverable flatboats directly into their traps. You thumb the hammer of your rifle back with a quiet metallic click, the sound loud enough to alert the remaining men who instantly understand the gravity of the signal. Silence reclaims the deck as the crew crouches low behind the stacked barrels of Pittsburgh flour and heavy crates of iron goods. The faint smell of alien smoke persists, a ghostly indicator of human presence in a landscape that should be empty of settlement. Weapons are leveled toward the black water, cold iron sights aligned with the shadows, as the men wait for the telltale splash of oars or the scrape of a hull against gravel. Minutes stretch into an agonizing eternity, the tension pulling the air tight and making every breath feel shallow and inadequate. The river continues its indifferent flow, the water lapping gently against the flatboat, wholly unconcerned with the violent potential suspended in the darkness above it. No attack comes, but the unseen camp remains a psychological anchor, tethering the crew to a state of high alert that will not break until the sun returns. You remain crouched beside a heavy oak barrel, the rough wood pressing hard against your shoulder blade. The initial surge of adrenaline begins to recede, leaving behind a hollow, jittery edge that makes your hands tremble slightly against the stock of your rifle. You watch the smoke from your own extinguished fire drift upward, hoping the darkness conceals your position as effectively as it hides your potential enemies. You calculate the distance to the next settlement, realizing that a call for help would simply vanish into the immense, unlistening void of the Ohio Valley. You accept the fundamental truth of the frontier, that survival depends strictly on the men within the perimeter of this wooden raft and the dry powder in their horns. You do not lower your weapon, choosing the ache of sustained readiness over the fatal cost of a sudden ambush. You feel the first shift in the night's temperature, a deepening cold that signals the approach of the midnight hour. The chorus of tree frogs begins to thin out, the chaotic noise replaced by the solitary, mournful call of a barred owl echoing from the high ridges. You carefully ease your cramped legs, extending them one at a time to keep the blood flowing without making a sound that might carry across the water. You count the slow, rhythmic pulses of your own heart, using the steady beat to ground your spiraling thoughts and maintain your focus on the immediate environment. You watch a thick bank of fog begin to form over the center channel, creeping slowly toward the anchored flatboat like a pale, living entity. You know the fog will provide a natural screen against observation, but it will also blind you to any threat approaching from the river. Fog rolls over the wooden gunwales, a freezing damp exhalation from the river that coats the deck planks in a slick layer of fresh moisture. The visual world shrinks dramatically, reducing visibility to a mere handful of feet in any direction and swallowing the dark outline of the shoreline without a trace. Sound becomes the only reliable sense, amplifying the gentle lap of the current and the occasional creak of the mooring line straining against the willow trucks. The men remain at their posts, wrapped tightly in their heavy wool coats, functioning as blind sentinels in a cloud of freezing vapor. The isolation achieves a new, terrifying absolute, cutting the flatboat off from the rest of the universe and suspending it in a gray, featureless void. Time seems to stop altogether, the night stretching out into an endless endurance test of cold, physical strain, and unwavering vigilance. You brush a heavy accumulation of condensation from the iron barrel of your rifle, ensuring the firing mechanism remains as dry as possible in the saturated air. The dampness seeps through the thick wool of your coat, settling a deep, bone-aching chill into your shoulders and chest. You move with agonizing slowness, walking the perimeter of the forward deck to keep your muscles from locking rigid in the freezing fog. You listen to the breathing of the other men, the steady, rhythmic inhales and exhales offering the only proof that you are not truly alone in the gray emptiness. You focused on the mechanical requirements of the watch, checking the tension on the forward rope, sweeping the invisible water with your hearing, maintaining the strict discipline required for survival. You refuse to let your mind wander into the comforting thought of sitting down, knowing that complacency is the most deadly enemy on the river. You stop at the bow, staring into the dense wall of mist that hides the treacherous current of the Ohio. The smell of the unknown wood smoke has vanished, washed away by the heavy moisture hanging in the air, leaving only the scent of wet timber and cold mud. You run your numb fingers over the smooth surface of the river stone in your pocket, seeking a small, tactile comfort against the overwhelming sensory deprivation of the fog. You understand that the night is only half over, the darkest and coldest hours still lying ahead before the slow return of the morning light. You draw a deep, shivering breath of the freezing air, anchoring yourself to the present moment and the heavy rifle in your hands. You stand your ground against the encroaching dark, a silent guardian on a floating island of commerce, waiting for the slow turn of the earth to bring the dawn. Dense moisture clings to every exposed surface of the wooden raft. Frost begins to form on the iron cleats, a delicate crystalline lace that burns the bare skin upon contact. A sudden sharp crack echoes from the eastern bank, sounding exactly like a heavy branch giving way under its own accumulated weight. You shift your stance to avoid a puddle of condensed vapor pooling near the bowpost. You listen to the reverberation die away, swallowed by the immense acoustic dampening of the mist. You step away from the forward rail to begin a slow, methodical patrol of the cargo perimeter. The deck planks are slick with a lethal combination of river slime and fresh frost, demanding deliberate and careful footfalls. You trail your left hand along the rough staves of the oak barrels, reading the integrity of the wood through the thick calluses on your palm. A faint vibration travels through the timber, the mechanical resonance of the current fighting against the massive resistance of the hull. You find a strange comfort in this tactile inspection, a physical reassurance that the fortress of commerce remains intact. You reach the central storage hutch and test the heavy brass padlocks securing the merchant's strongbox. The metal is astonishingly cold, leaching the heat from your fingertips in a matter of seconds. You pull a small tallow-soaked rag from your coat pocket and rub it vigorously over the locking mechanism to prevent the internal tumblers from freezing solid. The smell of rendered animal fat cuts through the sterile odor of the fog, a harsh reminder of the slaughtered livestock that funded this expedition. You return the rag to your pocket, satisfied that the lock will open when the daylight eventually returns. Water drips with a steady, maddening rhythm from the canvas tarpaulins strung over the central hold. Each drop strikes the wooden deck with a distinct hollow percussion that amplifies in the unnatural quiet. You kneel beside a loose lashing and pry the stiffened hemp rope apart with your thumbs, forcing the fibers to bend against a freezing temperature. The physical exertion warms the muscles of your forearms, sending a welcome flush of blood through your chilled extremities. You tie a new, complex securing knot, testing its strength by putting your entire body weight into a sudden backward pull. You rise and walk toward the stern, navigating the narrow passage between the stacked crates and the low gunwale. The air here smells faintly of the unwashed bodies of the sleeping crew, huddled together for warmth beneath thin wool blankets. You observe their slow, rhythmic breathing, recognizing the fragile vulnerability of men stripped of their daytime bravado. You step carefully over a discarded wooden canteen, ensuring your heavy boots do not disturb their necessary recovery. You envy their temporary escape from the psychological weight of the watch, the relentless burden of anticipating a threat that may never materialize. You grip the long handle of the rear steering sweep, finding the wood polished smooth by thousands of hours of desperate labor. The massive oar rests in its iron oarlock, secured by a thick leather strap that groans softly as the boat shifts in the current. You press your forehead against the cold timber, closing your eyes for a singular, dangerous moment to relieve the burning strain in your retinas. You visualize the intricate map of the river, tracing the bends and shoals from Pittsburgh to the distant delta in your mind. You open your eyes again, forcing your attention back to the gray, featureless wall of mist pressing against the raft. Shadows play tricks in the deep night, transforming ordinary shapes into lurking menaces. A coiled rope resembles a striking serpent, while a draped tarp mimics the hunched shoulders of an intruder. You blink rapidly to clear the visual distortion, relying on your hearing to verify the emptiness of the deck. The river water slaps rhythmically against the flat stern, a continuous liquid drumbeat that underscores the isolation. You pull a brass spyglass from your belt, knowing it is useless in the fog, but finding comfort in the solid weight of the instrument. You turn your back to the wind and scan the layout of the forward camp, looking for any sign of shifting cargo. The heavy iron stove sits cold and lifeless, a dark monument to the extinguished fire. You walk toward it, feeling the crunch of fresh frost beneath the thick leather soles of your boots. You run your hand over the cast iron surface, finding no lingering trace of the evening's heat. You imagine the roaring fires of the taverns back east, the warmth and security of a world governed by stone walls and reliable magistrates. You pry open the heavy iron door of the stove and inspect the bed of gray ashes inside. A single stubborn ember glows faintly in the deepest corner, a tiny ruby of heat fighting a losing battle against the overwhelming cold. You gather a handful of dry pine needles from the kindling box and drop them carefully onto the dying coal. You blow softly into the iron chamber, watching the red glow intensify and spread across the brittle needles until a tiny, fragile flame erupts. You feed it a few thin twigs, building a miniature fire that offers no real warmth but provides a crucial psychological anchor in the darkness. Hours stretch into an unmeasurable void, marking time only by the increasing severity of the cold. The fog shows no sign of lifting, maintaining its suffocating grip on the river valley. You pace a tight circle around the small stove, keeping your blood moving to ward off the encroaching numbness in your extremities. You pull your collar higher, burying your face in the rough wool to trap the meager heat of your own breath. You watch the tiny fire consume a thicker piece of oak, the sudden flare illuminating the sharp angles of the stacked crates in brief, frantic bursts. You draw your hunting knife from its leather sheath, the friction producing a quiet, metallic hiss. You find a small, discarded block of white pine and begin to carve away the rough edges with precise, measured strokes of the steel blade. The repetitive motion of whittling focuses your scattered thoughts, providing a simple, mechanical task to anchor your restless mind. You watch the thin, curling shavings fall to the frosted deck, pale ribbons of wood collecting in a small pile at your feet. You do not carve a specific shape, merely allowing the knife to follow the natural grain of the timber. You sheath the knife and sweep the wooden shavings into the small fire, watching them ignite in a sudden brilliant flash. The momentary burst of light blinds you, leaving dark purple afterimages dancing across your vision when you look back out into the fog. You rub your eyes vigorously, cursing your own foolishness for destroying your hard-won night vision. You lean against the cold iron of the stove, waiting patiently for your pupils to dilate and the gray shapes of the deck to resolve once more. You hear a low, mournful howl rise from the western ridges, the distinct call of a timber wolf claiming its territory in the wilderness. Wild cries hang in the freezing air, a raw expression of primal survival that echoes from miles across the empty valley. You listen as a second wolf answers from a greater distance, their voices intertwining in a complex, eerie harmony. You realize that you are an intruder in their domain, a slow-moving target carrying a fortune in meat and iron through a landscape that recognizes only the currency of blood. You grip the barrel of your musket, the cold steel grounding you against the sudden spike of feral terror. You wait for the howling to cease, the subsequent silence feeling heavier and more oppressive than before. You step away from the stove and resume your slow patrol of the perimeter, your boots finding the same treacherous path through the frost. You check the tension on the forward mooring lines again, verifying that the massive weight of the raft has not pulled the willow trunks loose from the muddy bank. You lean out over the gunwale, staring straight down into the black water rushing past the hull. You see the faint, swirling shapes of underwater currents, chaotic eddies that threaten to pull any fallen object down into the crushing depths. You step back quickly, a sudden vertigo washing over you at the thought of the freezing, suffocating embrace of the river. You walk to the starboard side and inspect the heavy sweeps, checking the leather bindings that secure the long poles to the wooden pegs. You notice a slight fraying in one of the thick straps, a point of weakness that could prove disastrous in a sudden fight against the current. You pull a fresh length of rawhide from your supply pouch and begin the arduous task of reinforcing the binding in the dark. You work by touch alone, your numb fingers fumbling with the stiff leather as you weave it through the iron rings. You pull the final knot tight with your teeth, tasting the bitter salt and dirt cured into the hide. Rawhide shrinks as it dries, creating a bond stronger than iron around the wooden sweep handle. You test the repair by throwing your weight against the pole, satisfied by the solid, unyielding resistance of the reinforced joint. You wipe a streak of freezing mud from your cheek, the grit scratching sharply against your chilled skin. You look up at the sky, searching for any break in the fog that might reveal the position of the stars. You find only a continuous, unbroken ceiling of gray vapor, a claustrophobic dome that seals the flatboat inside its own isolated universe. You return to the center of the deck, standing among the towering stacks of trade goods. You press your hand against the barrel of Kentucky bourbon, feeling the dense, heavy reality of the liquid trapped inside the oak staves. You consider the strange economics of the frontier, where a liquid distilled from corn can command a higher price than the iron tools required to build a settlement. You move to the next crate, filled with delicate glass panes packed securely in layers of raw wool. You marvel at the fragility of the cargo, a stark contrast to the brutal, unforgiving nature of the journey required to deliver it. You hear a sudden, sharp intake of breath from the sleeping area, followed by the frantic thrashing of a man caught in a nightmare. You step quickly toward the sound, finding a young crewman tangled in his wool blanket, his face contorted in a mask of sleeping terror. You kneel beside him and place a heavy, reassuring hand on his shoulder, shaking him gently until his eyes snap open in the gloom. You offer no words of comfort, merely a silent nod to confirm that the watch is held and the boat remains secure. You watch him pull the blanket tight against his chin, his breathing slowly returning to a steady, even rhythm as the nightmare fades. Deepest night settles over the river, the temperature bottoming out in the hours just before the first hint of false dawn. The frost on the deck thickens into a solid sheet of treacherous ice, coating the timber in a glassy armor that reflects the faint light of the stove's embers. You pull your collar higher and tuck your hands deep into your armpits, fighting a violent shiver that racks your exhausted frame. You know this is the crucial test of endurance, the moment when the body demands surrender, but the mind must enforce absolute discipline. You focus your attention on the sound of the water, letting the rhythmic lapping anchor you to the physical reality of the watch. You walk the perimeter once more, your movements stiff and mechanical as you fight the encroaching numbness in your joints. You check the sky again, desperate for any subtle shift in the darkness that might signal the approaching morning. You see nothing but the same impenetrable gray fog, a relentless adversary that refuses to yield its grip on the river valley. You return to the bow and lean against the cold wooden post, your heavy rifle resting across your forearms. You brace yourself for the final hours of the watch, a silent, solitary guardian standing between the sleeping crew and the unseen terrors of the frontier. You reach down and inspect the scene where the thick deck planks meet the forward gunwale. You run your bare fingertips along the joint, feeling for the sticky, resinous texture of the pine pitch used to seal the timber against the relentless intrusion of the river. You discover a small patch where the pitch has grown brittle and chipped away in the freezing cold, leaving a hairline fracture exposed to the elements. You retrieve a heavy iron scraper from the tool chest and begin to carefully clear the damaged area, the harsh scraping sound echoing flatly in the dense mist. You know that even the smallest breach can compromise the entire vessel, a slow leak that could quietly swamp the flatboat while the crew remains oblivious. You pull a lump of raw, unheated pitch from a leather satchel and press it firmly into the clean fracture. You use the rounded handle of your hunting knife to work the stubborn material deep into the grain of the wood, applying steady, crushing pressure to ensure a watertight seal. You rub your hands vigorously together afterward, trying to remove the sticky residue that clings tenaciously to your skin. You smell the sharp, piney odor of the pitch, a scent that speaks of distant eastern forests and the shipyards where this clumsy raft was hastily assembled. You stand back and survey your repair, satisfied that the crude patch will hold until a proper heating pot can be prepared in the daylight. Wind direction shifts subtly, bringing a new current of air straight down the center of the river channel. The heavy fog begins to swirl and eddy, breaking apart into dense, isolated pockets of mist that drift past the hull like pale apparitions. You watch the water surface become visible in brief, tantalizing glimpses, revealing a surface that is black and slick as polished obsidian. You hear the sudden, sharp crack of a freezing branch breaking in the nearby woods, the sound carrying with terrifying clarity through the thinning vapor. You tighten your grip on the musket, scanning the shifting landscape for any sign that the broken branch was caused by a human footfall rather than the sheer weight of the ice. You hold your breath and listen intently, filtering out the constant noise of the river to isolate any anomalous sounds from the eastern bank. You hear nothing but the wind rustling through the dead leaves of the winter oaks, a dry, papery whisper that offers no clues. You step closer to the rail, peering into the gloom until your eyes water from the cold and the intense focus. You understand that paranoia is a necessary tool out here, a survival mechanism that keeps you alive when every natural advantage belongs to the predators in the trees. You slowly exhale, lowering the rifle slightly, but maintaining your vigilant stance. You turn your attention to the massive pile of coiled hemp ropes secured near the forward mast. You untie the securing knots and begin to flake the heavy line across the deck, checking every foot of the thick fiber for signs of rot or serious abrasion. You run the rope through your bare hands, the coarse texture acting like rough sandpaper against your chilled skin. You find a section where the outer strands have parted, exposing the pale, vulnerable cord to the damp air. You cut a short length of thin twine and execute a tight, intricate whipping knot around the damaged section, binding the fibers together to prevent a catastrophic failure when the line is under tension. Repairing gear in the pitch black requires an intimate, physical knowledge of the materials and the tools. You feel the tension of the twine cutting into your fingers as you pull each wrap flush against the previous one, building a solid sleeve of protection over the weakened hemp. You secure the final tuck with a sharp yank, severing the excess twine with a quick stroke of your blade. You coil the massive rope back into its designated position, the organized weight offering a small sense of order against the chaotic unpredictability of the river. You secure the plow with a heavy canvas strap, ensuring it will not shift if the flatboat is forced to navigate rough water without warning. You walk back toward the small iron stove, drawn by the desperate need for even the illusion of warmth. You crouch beside the cold metal and press your bare hands flat against the side, absorbing the minuscule amount of residual heat trapped in the thick cast iron. You close your eyes and focus entirely on that faint sensation, allowing it to push back the bone-deep chill that threatens to paralyze your limbs. You imagine the sun rising over the eastern bluffs, a brilliant golden sphere that will melt the frost and banish the suffocating gray mist. You open your eyes and face the reality of the freezing night, knowing the dawn is still hours away and the watch must be maintained. You stand up and perform a series of harsh, physical stretches, forcing your stiff muscles to lengthen and contract. You twist your torso from side to side, feeling the joints in your lower back pop and release the tension accumulated during hours of standing motionless. You swing your arms in wide, aggressive arcs, driving the sluggish blood back down into your freezing fingertips. You perform these exercises in absolute silence, a ghost performing the strange, solitary ritual on a floating island of timber. You feel your heart rate elevate slightly, the physical exertion providing a temporary defense against the relentless assault of the cold. Blackness gives way to the deepest, most profound shade of charcoal gray, a subtle shift that indicates the night has reached its absolute nadir. The air pressure drops significantly, a heavy, oppressive weight that makes every breath feel like drawing water into the lungs. You notice a change in the behavior of the river, the surface growing strangely calm as the wind dies completely away. You watch the water transform into a perfect, flawless mirror, reflecting the gray nothingness of the fog back upon itself. You feel a sudden intense wave of vertigo, the loss of visual reference points making it difficult to distinguish where the sky ends and the river begins. You grip the wooden rail tightly, using the solid, tactile sensation to ground your disoriented senses. You force yourself to look away from the mesmerizing void of the water, focusing instead on the rough texture of the deck planks beneath your boots. You count the nails securing the nearest cargo crate, a simple, repetitive mental task designed to break the hypnotic spell of the fog. You pull the river stone from your pocket and turn it rapidly between your fingers, the smooth, cold surface acting as a physical anchor to reality. You take a slow, deliberate breath, steadying your nerves as you prepare to endure the final, darkest stretch of the long watch. You step away from the edge and begin a final, meticulous inspection of the flatboat's defensive perimeter. You check the priming on the 3 spare muskets laid out on the central crates, ensuring the powder in the pans remains dry and ready for instantaneous use. You verify the placement of the heavy iron boarding pikes, their sharp forged tips pointing outward to repel any sudden assault from the water. You count the heavy wooden buckets filled with river sand, positioned strategically to extinguish any fire arrows lobbed onto the flammable canvas tarps. You find grim satisfaction in these lethal preparations, an acknowledgement that survival on the frontier requires a ruthless commitment to overwhelming force. You return to your post at the bow, your posture rigid and uncompromising against the freezing mist. You listen to the total, absolute silence that has fallen over the river valley, a quiet so profound it rings with a high metallic pitch in your ears. You know this is the hour when men die in their sleep, when the cold stops the heart and the darkness claims the unwary. You refuse to yield to the exhaustion pulling at your mind, maintaining a fierce, unblinking vigilance over the sleeping crew and the precious cargo. You stand like a statue carved from the very frost that coats the deck, an unyielding sentinel waiting for the slow, inevitable turning of the earth to bring the light. The freezing mist clings to the surface of the Ohio River, a tangible curtain that isolates the flatboat from the vast continent beyond the muddy banks. Ice crystals form along the rough edges of the oak gunwales, reflecting the faint ambient starlight that barely penetrates the thick vapor. The massive wooden raft sits heavy in the water, trapped in a perfect atmospheric suspension where neither wind nor current seems to exist. Silence acts as a heavy blanket over the valley, broken only by the microscopic sounds of timber expanding and contracting in the plummeting temperature. This is the deepest portion of the night, a suspended reality, where the boundary between the physical world and the frozen mist blurs into a single gray canvas. The isolation achieves a terrifying purity, severing all visual ties to the shoreline and leaving the vessel floating in a featureless void. You shift your weight from your left leg to your right, the leather of your boots stiff and unyielding against your numbed toes. The relentless cold permeates the layers of your wool coat, seeking the last remaining pockets of warmth trapped against your skin. You curl your fingers inside your pockets, rubbing the rough pads of your thumbs against your knuckles to force the sluggish blood to circulate. The physical demand of standing watch requires a constant, internal battle against the seductive pull of exhaustion and the biological mandate to sleep. You force your eyes to remain wide open, tracing the faint outlines of the stacked crates and barrels to ensure your vision remains active in the monotonous dark. You know that closing your eyes for even a fraction of a second invites a lethal complacency that the frontier ruthlessly punishes. You step away from the bow post, placing your boots deliberately on the frost-covered planks to avoid slipping on the treacherous surface. The faint friction of leather against ice sounds unnaturally loud in the hushed environment, a scraping noise that makes you wince with involuntary anxiety. You walk toward the center of the cargo hold, running your hand along the freezing iron hoops of a salt pork barrel. The metal bites into your bare palm, a sharp tactile shock that momentarily clears the haze of fatigue clouding your mind. You lean your back against the solid oak staves, absorbing the immense grounded weight of the cargo to steady your trembling muscles. The physical connection to the trade goods reminds you of the immense financial stakes riding on your ability to stay awake and alert. Heavy iron chains secure the main supply chest of the decking, the linked metal coated in a fine layer of white rind. The padlock securing the lid rests against the wood, a dense block of brass that feels heavier than normal in the freezing air. Inside that chest lies the navigation ledger, a fragile collection of paper mapping the treacherous shoals and bends of this unforgiving waterway. The ink on those pages represents the collective survival knowledge of countless rivermen who braved these currents before you. Protecting that knowledge is as vital as guarding the flour and the iron, a necessity for ensuring the flatboat eventually reaches the southern markets intact. Loss of the ledger would leave the crew sailing blind into waters notorious for claiming even experienced pilots. You kneel beside the chest and brush a layer of accumulated frost from the flat brass surface of the lock. The cold radiates through your fingertips, a stinging sensation that quickly fades into a dull, persistent ache. You verify the shackle remains securely engaged, pulling downward on the mechanism with a sharp, testing jerk. You understand that desperate men roaming the wilderness value tools and information just as highly as raw currency or trade goods. You stand up, your knees popping in the hushed night, the sound echoing briefly against the stacked wooden crates surrounding you. You adjust your stance to accommodate the stiffness in your joints, accepting the physical pain as the necessary cost of vigilance. You retrieve a small piece of hardened tree resin from your pouch, rolling the amber lump between your palms to generate a tiny amount of friction heat. The sharp, clean scent of pine bleeds into the air, cutting through the overwhelming odor of damp wool and muddy river water. You breathe the fragrance in deeply, allowing the memory of sunlit eastern forests to replace the claustrophobic reality of the fog-bound river for a fleeting second. You trace the irregular edges of the resin with your thumbnail, memorizing the topography of the small object without needing to see it. You return the lump to your pouch, preserving the scent for another moment when the isolation threatens to overwhelm your senses. Small tactile rituals keep the mind from fracturing under the immense weight of the unbroken darkness. Water slaps against the rudder with a hollow, relentless heartbeat, indicating the current still pushes against the anchored vessel. The river never truly rests, an untamed artery carrying silt and driftwood toward the distant delta regardless of the hour or the weather. Submerged branches scrape occasionally against the flat bottom of the hull, vibrating through the thick timber and up into the soles of boots. The Ohio is a vast, unfeeling entity that tolerates the passage of merchant rafts, but offers no sanctuary to those who fail to respect its hidden dangers. Maintaining an anchor position requires trusting the strength of the hemp lines and the deeply rooted willow trees holding the vessel against the endless pull. The tension on those ropes is the only thing preventing the flatboat from drifting blindly into a fatal collision with a limestone bluff. You step toward the port side rail, leaning your weight against the heavy timber to peer down into the black water. The surface remains obscured by the thick layer of freezing mist, but the chaotic churning of the current is audible just below the edge of the hull. You pull your collar up over your mouth, trapping the warmth of your exhalations against your freezing cheeks and nose. You listen for the specific, dangerous sound of an approaching skiff, the muffled dip of oars, or the subtle clink of metal that would signal an ambush. You trust your ears more than your eyes in this suffocating vapor, mapping the surrounding environment purely through acoustic variations. The predators of the frontier use the weather to their advantage, striking when their victims are blinded and immobilized by the elements. You pull the heavy flintlock rifle closer to your chest, the iron barrel radiating a cold intensity that rivals the ambient air. The mechanism requires constant attention in this saturated environment to prevent the black powder from drawing moisture and refusing to spark. You run your thumb over the leather frizzen cover, a small waterproof hood designed to protect the fragile priming powder from the encroaching dampness. You know the outlaws hiding in the limestone caves do not suffer from the same exposure, watching from dry shelters as merchants drift past. You maintain your grip on the weapon, an unspoken vow to defend the cargo and the sleeping men against the human predators haunting the territory. The firearm is a blunt instrument of frontier justice, the only law recognized in the unmapped spaces beyond the eastern settlements. Minutes stretch into a seamless, unmeasured expanse of endurance, unmarked by any celestial progression or shift in the shadows. The sky remains an impenetrable dome of gray, offering no hint of the approaching false dawn or the eventual return of the sun. The crew sleeps on in the forward section, their huddled forms indistinguishable from the piles of canvas and coiled rope covering the deck. Survival in this era demands a stoic acceptance of physical misery, a willingness to suffer the cold and the fear without complaint. The watch stands as a necessary sacrifice, a lonely vigil protecting the fragile bubble of civilization floating on the edge of the wild continent. Endurance becomes a mechanical process, forcing the body to remain upright long after the reserves of energy have been depleted. Desperation drives a search for any remaining source of heat, drawing the frozen watchman back toward the small iron stove. Kneeling on the frosted deck allows a closer inspection of the dark, ash-filled belly of the firebox through the heavy cast-iron door. The interior contains nothing but cold gray flakes and charred remnants of pine twigs, the heat having fled hours ago into the unforgiving night air. Closing the door produces a hushed, metallic clink that finalizes the resignation to finishing the watch without the psychological comfort of a flame. Arms wrapped tightly around the torso, trapping the last vestiges of body heat beneath the heavy layers of damp wool. The cold is a physical adversary now, pressing inward from all sides with an unrelenting pressure that threatens to crack the resolve of the mind. You walk the length of the flatboat once more, measuring the 50 feet of timber with measured, deliberate strides to combat the stiffness in your legs. The cargo hold is a silent maze of barrels and crates, a geometric landscape of wealth destined for southern markets if the river allows passage. You check the tarpaulin securing the flour, ensuring the stiff freezing canvas has not pulled loose from the iron tie-down rings. You run your hand along a taut hemp rope, the fibers rigid and abrasive against your calloused skin. You rely on these small repetitive tasks to tether your wandering mind to the physical reality of the vessel and the demands of the long night. The tactile input grounds you, preventing the hallucinatory tricks of the fog from taking root in your exhausted brain. Frost continues to accumulate on every horizontal surface, turning the flatboat into a ghostly, white-rimed apparition floating in the mist. The moisture in the air crystallizes rapidly, forming delicate patterns on the rough wood that crackle faintly under the weight of a passing boot. The cold achieves a penetrating structural quality, sinking past the layers of clothing to ache directly within the bones of the spine and shoulders. The entire valley seems suspended in this glacial hold, a frozen tableau waiting for the inevitable intervention of daylight to break the spell. Standing motionless invites a dangerous lethargy, a creeping numbness that deadens the pain, but also degrades the vital reflexes needed for survival. The body begs to sit down, offering deceptive promises of comfort that lead only to a fatal hypothermia. You crouch behind a stack of iron goods, using the heavy wooden crates as a windbreak against the subtle, shifting breeze. You pull the wide brim of your hat down low over your brow, shielding your eyes from the stinging bite of the freezing mist. You listen to the rhythmic breathing of the older steersman sleeping just a few yards away, his chest rising and falling beneath a pile of heavy blankets. You consider the lifetime of experience etched into the deep lines of his face, the countless miles of river he has navigated to survive this long. You draw strength from his presence, knowing you are part of a continuous lineage of men who have defied the wilderness to build a nation. His survival is proof that the river can be beaten, a tangible beacon of hope in the darkest hour of the journey. You trace the grain of the oak crate beside you, feeling the raised ridges and shallow valleys carved into the wood by the sawyer's blade. The texture is a tangible connection to the eastern forests, a reminder of the raw materials that fuel the expansion of the western frontier. You think of the blacksmiths and coopers who crafted these goods, their labor now entrusted to your vigilant care on this vulnerable wooden raft. You shift your position slightly, alleviating the pressure on your aching knees while keeping your musket leveled toward the port side rail. You maintain your focus on the gray nothingness, a solitary guard standing watch over the silent cargo as the deepest hour of the night grinds slowly onward. The responsibility of the watch is a heavy mantle, worn with silent pride and grim determination. Leather straps securing the side sweeps emit a faint, strained groan as the river current surges unexpectedly against the submerged blades. The rawhide bindings have frozen into rigid bands of iron-hard material, resisting the natural flex of the wooden poles. Each subtle shift of the water transmits a physical shockwave through the heavy timber of the hull, vibrating through the frost-coated deck planks. The mechanical stress on the vessel is a constant, unseen antagonist, wearing down the structural integrity of the flatboat mile by mile. Surviving the journey requires an intimate understanding of these subtle physical complaints, addressing the failing ropes and cracked wood before the river exploits the weakness. A snapped sweep oar in the middle of a rapid would spell certain disaster for the unmaneuverable craft. You walk toward the starboard gunwale to inspect the frozen bindings, your boots sliding marginally on the treacherous layer of surface ice. You wrap your bare fingers around the thick rawhide knot, testing the tension with a sudden, forceful downward pull. The icy leather burns your skin, leaving a raw red friction mark across the palm of your hand when you release your grip. You retrieve a small wooden mallet from the main tool chest, tapping the frozen knot with measured strikes to break the ice without shattering the brittle rawhide. You return the mallet to its designated slot, satisfied the securing strap will hold the sweep firmly in place against the pull of the water. Preventative maintenance in the freezing dark is a brutal necessity, ensuring the tools of survival remain functional when the sun finally rises. You pull a dense woolen scarf higher over the bridge of your nose, filtering the freezing vapor before it reaches your aching lungs. The coarse fabric smells of lanolin and wood smoke, a heavy, unwashed scent that offers a strange, visceral comfort in the sterile environment of the fog. You pace the length of the cargo hold again, relying on the repetitive motion to generate a fractional amount of internal body heat. You stop near the aft supply locker, your attention caught by a subtle, rhythmic tapping sound coming from somewhere beneath the waterline. You press your ear against the cold deck planks, isolating the noise from the ambient slap of the river to determine its source. The acoustic landscape of the flatboat is a complex puzzle, demanding constant interpretation to separate harmless debris from active threats. Driftwood trapped against the front of the flatboat strikes the heavy oak hull with a persistent, hollow knocking. The submerged timber rolls and grinds against the flat bottom, pushed relentlessly by the undercurrents swirling through the deepest part of the channel. The sound mimics the approach of a stealthy boarding party, matching the muted strike of a wooden paddle against the small skiff. Discerning the difference between natural debris and an organized ambush requires nerves of steel and an encyclopedic knowledge of the river's acoustic signature. The tension never abates, maintaining a tight, uncomfortable knot in the stomach of every man tasked with guarding the cargo in the dark. The imagination is a dangerous enemy, constantly turning every stray piece of floating wood into an approaching boat of armed killers. Vision fails against the impenetrable gray void, forcing a blind search for the offending piece of debris trapped against the bow. The mist reflects the faint starlight in a confusing, scattered haze, making it impossible to see past the first few feet of churning water. A long wooden pike resting near the rail serves as an extension of the arm, driving the iron tip downward into the invisible current to dislodge the snag. The heavy thud of the metal striking waterlogged timber vibrates up the pole and into fatigued shoulders. Pushing with all remaining strength finally breaks the debris loose, allowing it to scrape along the side of the hull before vanishing into the downstream fog. The physical exertion leaves the lungs burning for air, a stark reminder of the body's fragile limits in the extreme cold. You set the heavy pike down on the deck, your chest heaving with the sudden exertion in the thin, freezing air. You wipe a line of cold sweat from your temple, your body confusing the physical strain with the ambient temperature of the environment. You turn your back to the river and lean against the stacked crates of iron tools, letting the solid weight of the cargo support your trembling legs. You listen to the silence returning to the valley, the persistent knocking sound replaced by the familiar, soothing lap of the water against the stern. You draw a ragged breath, the immediate crisis resolved, but the larger, existential threat of the frontier night remaining firmly in place. You command your heart rate to slow, forcing a calm you do not feel over your strained nervous system. Metallic cold radiates from the stack of iron goods, the forged tools acting as a massive heatsink drawing warmth from the surrounding air. The heavy crates contain plows, axes, and adzes bound for the raw settlements carving a foothold in the western wilderness. These tools represent the blunt force required to tame the continent, the iron edges destined to fell ancient forests and break the virgin prairie soil. The weight of the iron settles the flatboat low in the water, making the craft sluggish and unresponsive, but providing the essential ballast needed to survive rough currents. The men guarding this shipment understand they are transporting the very instruments of civilization into a territory hostile to their presence. The cargo is a promise of future cities, currently held hostage by the untamed river. You trace the stenciled lettering on the side of an ammunition crate, the black paint raised and textured against the smooth pine wood. The cargo includes hundreds of pounds of lead shot and black powder, lethal commodities destined for the hunting rifles and defensive muskets of the southern outposts. You know this specific crate would be an irresistible prize for the river pirates operating out of the limestone caves downriver. You rest your hand on the sealed lid, mentally calculating the devastating firepower contained within the small wooden box. You adjust the sling of your own weapon, feeling the reassuring weight of the loaded musket pressing against your heavy wool coat. You prepare your mind for the violence that might be required to protect this specific portion of the shipment. You close your eyes for a brief, dangerous second, allowing the burning fatigue in your retinas to subside in the dark. You visualize the map of the Ohio River again, picturing the treacherous bends, the hidden shoals, and the isolated islands notorious for harboring outlaws. You plot the remaining distance to the Mississippi confluence, knowing the character of the journey will change once the flatboat enters the wider, faster waters. You open your eyes and shake your head sharply, refusing to let the comforting illusion of the map replace the harsh, freezing reality of the fog-bound deck. You resume your pacing, your boots finding the familiar path through the frost as the deepest hour of the night grinds mercilessly onward. You stand as the solitary barrier between the sleeping men and the void, holding a line until the earth turns and the darkness finally breaks. You sense the atmospheric shift before your eyes can actually register the change, a subtle lifting of the oppressive barometric weight that has crushed the river valley for hours. The impenetrable charcoal void dominating the eastern horizon dilutes into a bruised indigo hue that barely registers against the fatigued retinas. This is not yet dawn, merely the reluctant retreat of absolute blackness surrendering to the inevitable rotation of the earth. The freezing fog loses its uniform density, breaking apart into striated layers that hover inches above the surface of the Ohio. You draw a ragged breath, the air feeling microscopically less jagged in your lungs than it did an hour ago. The agonizing endurance test of the solitary watch is drawing to a close, yielding to the communal survival of the waking crew. You flex your numbed fingers around the heavy walnut stock of the musket, feeling the familiar grain of the wood to the thick wool of your gloves. A sudden sharp fracture echoes across the deck as a sheet of surface ice cracks under its own expanding pressure. The sound rings with a brittle metallic clarity entirely different from the muffled acoustics of the deep night. You shift your weight, your boots crunching loudly on the frozen planks, the noise serving as an unintentional alarm clock for the sleeping men. The transition from night to morning on the frontier is never a graceful awakening, but a harsh, physical extraction from the minimal comfort of a wool blanket. You wait for the inevitable groans and curses that accompany the return to consciousness in a frozen environment. The older steersman is the first to stir, his dark silhouette rising slowly from the pile of canvas like an ancient bear emerging from hibernation. He coughs a dry, rattling sound into the crook of his elbow, the noise harsh and scraping in the hushed valley. He does not speak to you, merely offering a brief grim nod of acknowledgement that the vessel remains secure and the cargo unplundered. You return the gesture, feeling a profound wave of relief wash over your exhausted frame as the burden of singular responsibility lifts. The other crewmen begin to untangle themselves from their frost-rimed bedrolls, their movements sluggish and uncoordinated in the sub-freezing temperature. The flatboat transforms from a solitary outpost back into a functioning, populated vessel of commerce. You step away from the bow, relinquishing your post to join the collective effort of preparing the raft for departure. The small iron stove requires immediate attention, its cast iron belly completely devoid of any residual warmth from the previous evening. You watch a younger deckhand attack the frozen kindling box with a heavy iron pry bar, chipping away the ice that has sealed the wooden lid shut. He retrieves a handful of brittle pine twigs and a lump of valuable dry oakum, building a meticulous nest in the center of the cold grate. The strike of flint against steel provides a sudden, sharp rhythm, repeating until a single, precious spark catches in the frayed fibers. You observe the fragile flame catch and spread, a tiny miracle of heat and light in the gray expanse. Smoke begins to curl upward from the iron chimney pipe, initially thin and pale before thickening into a dark, resinous column. The scent of burning pine pitch aggressively displaces the sterile odor of the mist, a rugged perfume that signals the start of the laboring day. You pull your scarf down from your face, allowing the raw, unfiltered air to hit your skin and wake your dormant senses. The indigo light in the east slowly bleeds into a pale, washed-out slate, revealing the stark outlines of the towering sycamores on the nearby bank. The river remains a churning, chaotic mystery, but the encroaching visibility offers a psychological victory over the unseen terrors of the night. You holster your sidearm, shifting your mental posture from defense to navigation. You retrieve a long-handled wooden mallet from the main tool chest, your hands trembling slightly as the adrenaline of the watch fully dissipates. The entire deck is coated in a treacherous armor of rime, a slick hazard that must be broken and cleared before the crew can safely operate the heavy side sweeps. You begin at the port gunwale, swinging the mallet in wide, measured arcs to shatter the frozen layer. The ice splinters and flies outward in brilliant, jagged shards, striking the stacked crates with a sound like scattered gravel. You establish a brutal, metronomic cadence, moving methodically backward toward the stern, while the other men follow with stiff brooms to sweep the debris into the water. This is the unglamorous reality of river travel, trading the terror of an ambush for the agonizing, physical grind of basic maintenance. A battered tin coffee pot is placed aggressively onto the heating surface of the stove, the water inside already slushy with half-formed ice. The cook throws a handful of coarse chicory root and the single precious scoop of actual coffee beans into the vessel, the resulting brew destined to be bitter and heavily caffeinated. You pause your ice-breaking labor to catch the first waft of the boiling liquid, the aroma triggering a deep, Pavlovian response in your empty stomach. Breakfast will consist of the same salted pork and dense cornbread from yesterday, but the hot liquid will provide the necessary illusion of sustenance. You lean on the handle of your mallet, watching the sky lighten degree by degree, the oppressive dome of the night lifting to expose the vastness of the Ohio Valley. The world feels immense and uncaring, dwarfing the struggles of the men on the wooden raft. You trudge through the freezing mud of the shallows once again, the icy water instantly penetrating your boots to shock your numbed toes. The heavy hip mooring lines have frozen solid overnight, transforming from flexible rope into rigid cables of ice and fiber. You cannot simply untie the complex knots securing the flatboat to the massive willow trunks. They must be battered into submission. You strike the frozen knot repeatedly with the flat side of a heavy iron hatchet, the impacts echoing loudly against the limestone bluffs on the opposite shore. You watch the ice fracture and fall away, exposing the dark, damp hemp underneath before finally wresting the stiff loops free from the rough bark. You haul the heavy sodden line back aboard the deck, your muscles screaming in protest against the sudden, massive exertion. The older steersman takes his position at the massive rear sweep, his weathered hands gripping the polished wood with familiar authority. You join two other men at the forward port oar, bracing your boots against a small wooden cleat nailed to the deck planks. The command to push off is given not with a shout, but with a sharp downward thrust of the steersman's chin. You throw your entire body weight against the heavy pole, driving the broad wooden blade into the muddy shallows. The flatboat groans in profound protest, the hull dragging heavily against the submerged gravel bar that held it safe through the night. You push until black spots dance in your peripheral vision, the combined strength of the crew finally breaking the massive raft free from the shore. You feel the sudden, stomach-dropping lurch as the river current catches the square bow of the vessel, instantly taking control of its trajectory. The sluggish, dead weight of the moored boat is replaced by a terrifying kinetic energy as the Ohio asserts its dominance. You scramble to reposition your grip on the sweep, matching the rhythm set by the steersman to angle the craft away from the dangerous shoreline debris. The water here is fast and chaotic, churning around submerged boulders and unseen snags that could tear the bottom out of the hull. You coordinate your movements with the men beside you, a silent synchronization born of absolute necessity and the shared desire to survive the next bend. The flatboat is a blunt instrument, and you are its flawed human engine. Golden light finally spears over the eastern ridge, catching the remaining mist and turning it into a blinding, luminous haze. The warmth of the sun is purely psychological at this hour, offering no real physical comfort against the biting wind, but it banishes the lingering phantoms of the night. You watch the fog burn away in ragged patches, revealing the true width and majesty of the great river. High limestone cliffs emerge on the western bank, their pale faces scored by thousands of years of erosion and seasonal floods. You see a flock of wild turkeys foraging in the brush near the water's edge, entirely unconcerned by the passage of the massive wooden box floating past them. The frontier reveals its stark, indifferent beauty, a landscape that exists entirely outside the concerns of commerce or human ambition. You secure your sweep oar in its leather resting strap and walk the length of the cargo hold to inspect the goods in the daylight. The tarpaulins covering the flour barrels are stiff as iron sheets, coated in a thick layer of white frost that must be carefully brushed away to prevent the canvas from cracking. You check the wooden wedges holding the crates of iron tools, striking them with the heel of your boot to ensure they haven't loosened during the turbulent launch. You find a small dark stain on the deck near a barrel of salted beef, indicating a minor leak of preserving brine. You make a mental note to tighten the iron hoops on that specific barrel at the next opportunity, knowing that spoiled meat could doom the entire crew to starvation. Every detail requires unblinking attention, as the smallest oversight cascades rapidly into a fatal error out here. The river narrows suddenly ahead, funneling the vast volume of water into a fast, deep chute flanked by treacherous shoals. The steersman shouts a rare, sharp command, his voice cutting through the ambient roar of the accelerating current. You rush back to the side sweep, grabbing the heavy pole just as the flatboat accelerates into the narrow passage. The water turns from muddy brown to a frothing, agitated white, the surface violently disturbed by submerged rock formations. You lean into the oar, fighting a sudden cross-current that threatens to spin the clumsy raft broadside into the channel. The physical exertion is absolute, requiring every ounce of strength in your back and shoulders to keep the vessel tracking straight through the turbulence. You watch the jagged edge of a limestone boulder slip past the hull by mere inches, the water boiling angrily against the unyielding stone. The sound is deafening, a continuous roar that drowns out the groans of the timber and the heavy breathing of the crew. You do not feel the cold anymore, your body entirely consumed by the massive surge of adrenaline required to navigate the hazard. You push and pull the heavy sweep with mechanical precision, locking your knees and using the leverage of your entire frame against the water. The passage lasts only a few terrifying minutes, but it drains the reserves of energy you carefully hoarded during the long night watch. The flatboat shoots out the end of the chute, hitting the slower, deeper water of the main channel with a massive, shuddering splash. You slub over the handle of the sweep oar, your chest heaving violently as you gasp for the thin, cold air. The other men are in similar states of exhaustion, some leaning against the cargo crates, others sitting heavily on the wet deck planks. The steersman remains at his post, his face an unreadable mask as he guides the vessel back into the center of the broad river. You realize that you have survived another gauntlet, another test of muscle and nerve orchestrated by the indifferent landscape. You wipe a mixture of sweat and river spray from your eyes, the salt burning sharply against your wind-chapped skin. The journey southward resumes its monotonous, grinding pace, a relentless forward motion dictated by the flow of the water. You accept a tin cup of the bitter, boiling chicory coffee from the young deckhand, your hand still trembling slightly from the adrenaline crash. The harsh liquid scalds the roof of your mouth, but the heat radiating down your throat is profoundly welcome. You sit on a sturdy wooden keg of iron nails, staring at the endless procession of trees lining the western bank. The morning sun climbs higher, finally generating enough genuine warmth to melt the remaining frost from the deck and the canvas covers. You watch the ice turn to water and run in tiny, dirty rivulets toward the scuppers, carrying away the grime of the previous day. The world feels slightly less hostile in the daylight, though you know the outlaws and the hidden snags remain just out of sight, waiting for their next opportunity. You notice a loose iron cleat near the starboard bow, the heavy nails pulling slightly free from the damp oak planking. You retrieve a heavy claw hammer and a handful of fresh, square-cut nails from the carpenter's chest. You kneel on the wet deck, positioning the iron fixture carefully before driving the first nail home with a series of loud, echoing strikes. You focus entirely on the geometry of the task, ensuring the metal is seated flush against the wood to prevent it from snagging a mooring line later. You drive 3 more nails into the thick timber, the repetitive, percussive sound providing a familiar, comforting rhythm. You appreciate the simple, tangible nature of the repair, a problem that can be permanently solved with applied force and basic ironmongery. Unlike the unpredictable threats of the river itself, you stand and stretch your aching back, arching your spine until a series of sharp pops releases the trapped tension. You look upward, spotting a pair of massive bald eagles circling lazily on the thermal currents rising from the warming bluffs. Their white heads catch the sunlight, brilliant pinpricks against the vast, cloudless expanse of the pale autumn sky. You follow their flight, marveling at the effortless grace that contrasts so sharply with the brutal, grinding labor of the men on the flatboat. You feel a momentary pang of envy for their untethered existence, free from the heavy burdens of commerce and the constant fear of ambush. You pull your gaze back down to the muddy water, grounding yourself in the heavy, unyielding reality of the floating wooden box. You move to the front of the raft, taking your position as the forward lookout for the mid-morning watch. The glare of the sun on the water is intense, forcing you to squint beneath the wide brim of your felt hat. You scan the surface for the subtle V-shaped ripples that indicate submerged logs or hidden gravel bars. You fall into a state of active meditation, your mind simultaneously focused on the immediate hazards and drifting through memories of the eastern settlements you left behind. You know this journey will change you, etching the harsh lessons of the frontier into your posture and your temperament. The hours stretch ahead, a continuous sequence of labor and vigilance that will not end until the flatboat finally reaches the distant wharves of New Orleans. You watch a massive, uprooted oak tree float past on the port side, its tangled root system resembling a grotesque wooden monster. The sheer scale of the debris is a sobering reminder of the floods that ravaged this valley during the spring thaws. You understand that the flatboat is a temporary intruder in the landscape governed by massive geological forces. You adjust your grip on the long wooden pole resting near the rail, ready to fend off any debris that drifts too close to the hull. You listen to the steady, unvarying rhythm of the river, a sound that has become the permanent soundtrack to your existence. The morning establishes its dominance over the valley, pushing the terrors of the night back into the shadows of the deep forest, leaving only the relentless physical demands of the day. Sunlight strikes the surface of the Ohio River with a blinding physical force as the morning slips inexorably into midday. The vast waterway transforms into a glittering sheet of hammered copper, reflecting the harsh glare straight upward into the weary faces of the crew. Heat radiates from the rough-hewn deck planks, baking the moisture from the timber and filling the air with the sharp scent of hot pine resin. The oppressive humidity of the river valley settles over the flatboat like a heavy woolen blanket, making every breath feel thick and labored. The physical relief of surviving the frozen night has vanished, replaced by a grueling test of endurance under a merciless, unclouded sky. You strip away the heavy wool coat that protected you through the dark hours, folding the stiff garment and stowing it atop a flour barrel. The sudden exposure to the humid air brings a temporary cooling sensation as the sweat on your linen shirt begins to evaporate. You roll the sleeves of your shirt past your elbows, exposing skin already burned red and peeling from days of relentless solar reflection. You trace the line of a fresh blister forming at the base of your right thumb, a raw consequence of wrestling the heavy steering sweep through the morning rapids. The physical toll of the journey maps itself across your body in cuts, burns, and deep muscle aches that offer no prospect of healing until New Orleans. The current slows its frantic pace as the river widens into a massive, sun-drenched basin flanked by towering groves of ancient cottonwood trees. Flurries of white, fibrous seeds drift down from the high branches on the sluggish breeze, settling onto the dark water like a bizarre summer snowfall. The dense canopy of the shoreline provides a sanctuary for thousands of cicadas, their unified mechanical buzzing forming a deafening wall of sound that drowns out the gentle lap of the waves. This slower water offers a brief respite from the frantic maneuvering required in the narrows, allowing the flatboat to drift steadily along the center channel. The men take advantage of the lull to perform necessary repairs, their movements slow and deliberate in the crushing midday heat. You walk toward the stern to inspect the heavy leather hinges securing the massive steering sweep to the rear deck block. The intense sun has baked the rawhide straps, rendering them stiff and dangerously brittle under the immense strain of guiding the heavy raft. You draw a small jar of rendered bear fat from your supply pouch and use 2 fingers to work the greasy salve into the parched leather. The thick grease melts upon contact with the hot binding, soaking deep into the porous material and restoring a measure of essential flexibility. You test the hinge by leaning your weight against the heavy wooden pole, satisfied by the smooth, silent rotation that replaces the earlier strained creaking. Talk among the crew drops to a hushed, tense murmur as the flatboat rounds a wide bend and approaches the notorious stretch of water known to harbor river pirates. The high limestone bluffs begin to crowd the western bank again, providing perfect, elevated vantage points for outlaws to spot approaching merchant vessels. Stories of the Mason gang and the ruthless Hartprop brothers circulate through the men like a contagion, fueling a grim paranoia that sours the bright afternoon. The frontier economy thrives on these vulnerable shipments, making every isolated raft a floating treasure chest for men who recognize no authority beyond the barrel of a musket. The absence of any organized law enforcement forces the merchants to rely solely on their own vigilance and the brutal mathematics of superior firepower. You retrieve your flintlock rifle from its resting place against the cargo box, the iron barrel painfully hot to the touch from resting in the direct sunlight. You carefully unseat the wooden ramrod and run a patch of oiled linen down the bore, ensuring the smoothbore barrel remains free of fouling and river grit. You check the edge of the flint secured in the hammer jaws, using the spine of your hunting knife to nap a fresh, sharp edge into the brittle stone. You understand that a misfire in a moment of ambush equals a death sentence in this unforgiving territory, making weapon maintenance a sacred, non-negotiable ritual. You set the loaded rifle back down in the shaded spot near your post, the lethal instrument a constant, necessary companion on the journey. A grim reminder of the river's inherent danger appears on the eastern bank, a shattered collection of heavy oak timbers resting half submerged in the muddy shallows. The broken hull of a previous flatboat lies stranded against a massive gravel bar, its cargo hold gutted, and its steering sweeps snapped like fragile twigs. The dark scavengers of the river valley have already picked the wreck clean, leaving only the waterlogged skeleton to serve as a silent warning to passing crews. The men on your raft stare at the ruin with a collective, silent dread, visualizing their own potential fate written in the splintered wood. The river does not care about the ambitions of merchants or the sweat of the laboring class, consuming mistakes and misfortune with equal, unblinking indifference. You shade your eyes with a callous hand and study the wreckage as the sluggish current carries your vessel safely past the treacherous shoal. You search the debris for any signs of fire or bullet holes, trying to determine if the disaster was an act of nature or the result of human predation. You see no obvious signs of a raid, only the brutal, crushing evidence of a heavy hull striking an unyielding obstacle at high speed. You let out a slow, measured breath, recognizing the razor-thin margin between a successful commercial voyage and an anonymous grave in the Ohio mud. You turn your back on the ruined boat, forcing your attention forward to the unbroken expanse of water still waiting to be navigated. Midday stretches into a grueling marathon of heat and monotonous labor, as the sun dictates the brutal rhythm of the afternoon. The air shimmers with visible heat waves rising off the deck, distorting the shapes of the cargo barrels and making the horizon appear to dance and waver. The cook brings up a wooden bucket of tepid river water mixed with a small measure of sour vinegar, a harsh concoction designed to cut through the dust coating the men's throats. The crew drinks sparingly, knowing the danger of consuming too much liquid while their bodies are locked in a state of high physical exertion. The sweat continuously drips from their chins and foreheads, stinging their eyes and staining their rough linen shirts with dark, salty patches. You step to the port side and grip the long handle of the sweeping oar, ready to relieve a younger deckhand who looks pale and unsteady in the baking heat. You plant your boots firmly on the blistering planks, adjusting your stance to maximize the leverage of your legs and minimize the strain on your exhausted back. You fall instantly into the grueling, repetitive cadence of the work, dipping the broad wooden blade into the river and pushing backward with your entire weight. You feel the heavy, unyielding resistance of the water traveling up the shaft of the pole, a physical manifestation of the immense task of moving a floating warehouse down a continent. You let the rhythm consume your thoughts, entering a state of blank endurance where only the next push and the next breath matter. The sheer scale of the wilderness surrounding the river becomes difficult to comprehend. A vast ocean of deciduous forest that extends unbroken for hundreds of miles. Massive flocks of passenger pigeons occasionally darken the sky, their wings creating a rushing, wind-like roar that momentarily drowns out the drone of the cicadas. Ancient sturgeon breach the surface of the muddy water, their prehistoric armored bodies flashing briefly in the sunlight before slipping back into the murky depths. This environment belongs to the wildlife and the indigenous nations who know its secrets, treating the passing flatboats as temporary, noisy anomalies. The isolation of the crew is absolute, a tiny island of human enterprise floating through a landscape that predates the concept of commerce. You pause your labor at the sweep to wipe a thick layer of grime from your face, using a relatively clean corner of your shirt. You notice a dark, threatening shape accumulating on the southern horizon. A massive thunderhead building rapidly in the unstable afternoon heat. You alert the older steersman, pointing toward the towering anvil-shaped cloud that promises a sudden disruption to the stifling calm of the river. You know, these late-day storms strike the Ohio Valley with terrifying ferocity, bringing twisting winds and torrential rains that can easily swamp a heavily laden craft. You secure your oar in its resting strap and move quickly toward the central cargo hold, anticipating the frantic order to batten down the protective canvas tarps. The atmosphere changes with shocking suddenness, the stagnant baking heat replaced by a sharp, cool downdraft that smells strongly of ozone and bruised vegetation. The surface of the river instantly loses its glassy reflection, chopped into thousands of dark, agitated wavelets by the advancing edge of the storm front. The crew moves with a desperate, practiced efficiency, unrolling the heavy tarpaulins and stretching them tight over the vulnerable barrels of flour and crates of salt. Ropes are thrown across the breadth of the flatboat, pulled taut and secured to the iron cleats with complex locking knots that will not slip in the rain. The urgency of the impending weather briefly unites the men, erasing their fatigue and replacing it with the sharp, clear focus of immediate survival. You grab a loose section of canvas flapping frantically in the rising wind and pull it down with all your strength over a stack of dry goods. You brace your knee against the edge of a crate, fighting the sudden gusts that try to tear the heavy fabric from your grasp. You shout for another man to secure the opposite corner, your voice barely audible over the deep, percussive roll of thunder echoing off the limestone bluffs. You tie a fast, secure half-hitch around the base of a sturdy oak barrel, the rough hemp rope biting into the raw blisters on your hands. You test the tension of the lashing, satisfied that the cover will hold against the deluge waiting to fall from the blackened sky. Rain arrives not in drops, but in a solid, blinding sheet of gray water that instantly obliterates the distant shoreline and reduces visibility to a few yards. The temperature plummets dramatically, turning the sudden soaking into a freezing, miserable experience for men who were baking in the sun just minutes before. The flatboat pitches and rolls in the chaotic cross-currents generated by the squall, its massive bulk feeling dangerously fragile against the raw power of the weather. Lightning fractures the dark sky in brilliant, jagged forks, followed instantly by concussive blasts of thunder that vibrate through the deck planks and rattle the teeth in the skull. The river demands strict submission to its moods, forcing the crew to abandon navigation and simply fight to keep the heavily loaded craft afloat. You crouch low against the central cargo box, seeking a meager fraction of shelter from the horizontal, stinging rain driven by the gale. You watch the water pooling rapidly on the deck, rushing toward the scuppers in dark, dirty streams, carrying away the accumulated dust and sweat of the afternoon. You grip the wooden edge of the crate to steady yourself as a massive swell lifts the bow of the raft, threatening to spill the unsecured gear into the river. You feel the humbling scale of the natural world, a stark reminder that the ambitions of the frontier merchants are wholly subject to the whims of the atmosphere. You endure the pounding deluge in silence, knowing that panic serves no purpose when trapped on a wooden box in the middle of a wild river. The fierce squall passes as quickly as it materialized, rolling eastward over the forested ridges and leaving behind a washed, dripping world. The heavy clouds break apart, allowing shafts of late afternoon sunlight to illuminate the rising mist steaming off the wet deck planks. The air is sharp and clean, carrying the distinct earthy scent of saturated soil and shattered leaves blown from the shoreline trees. The crew slowly emerges from their various crouches, shaking the water from their hats and wringing out the hems of their heavy woolen shirts. The flatboat resumes its steady, sluggish drift, surviving another minor crisis on the long, unforgiving journey toward the distant markets of the South. You stand up and stretch your cramped legs, your damp clothing clinging uncomfortably to your chilled skin in the wake of the storm. You move to the port rail and begin the arduous task of untying the complex knots securing the tarpaulins, the wet hemp now swollen and stubbornly resistant to your fingers. You fold the heavy, soaked canvas back, exposing the dry barrels beneath and verifying that the precious cargo survived the deluge unscathed. You let out a long, shuddering breath, the tension of the afternoon finally breaking as the immediate danger recedes into the distance. You look toward the western horizon, watching the sun begin its slow, inevitable descent toward the tree line. signaling the approach of another perilous frontier. Dusk. The sun finally drops behind the jagged tree line of the western bluffs, severing the direct light and plunging the river valley into a deep, bruised twilight. Shadows stretch across the muddy water, elongating the shapes of the towering sycamores until they touch the opposite bank. The oppressive heat of the afternoon surrenders quickly to the damp, creeping chill that always accompanies the approaching night on the Ohio. You watch the surface of the water shift from a glaring copper to a muted, oily black as the sky above transitions through shades of violet and slate. The frantic buzzing of the daytime cicadas begins to wane, replaced by the solitary, mournful trill of a lone tree frog testing the evening air. This is the hour of transition, a brief and nervous window between the grueling labor of the day and the tense vigilance of the dark. You retrieve your heavy wool coat from its resting place atop the flour barrel, shaking out the stiff fabric before pulling it over your aching shoulders. The wool still holds a faint, clinging dampness from the afternoon squall, smelling strongly of wet sheep and river mud. You fasten the heavy bone buttons with fingers that feel clumsy and swollen from hours of gripping the raw timber of the steering sweep. The returning cold bites at the exposed skin of your neck, prompting you to pull the thick collar high against your jawline. You feel the immediate comforting weight of the garment, a necessary armor against the plunging temperatures of the frontier autumn. You step your boots against the deck planks, trying to force the sluggish blood back into your numb toes as the twilight deepens. The old steersman signals the end of the day's progress with a sharp, downward gesture of his calloused hand, his eyes scanning the eastern bank for a suitable mooring. Navigating the treacherous currents in the dark is a fool's gamble, an invitation to shatter the heavy flatboat against an unseen limestone shoal or submerged sawyer. He points toward a small crescent-shaped cove sheltered by a dense thicket of weeping willows, their long branches trailing lazily in the sluggish eddy. The crew understands the silent command, immediately breaking from their exhausted stupor to man the heavy side sweeps for one final, desperate push. The wooden poles groan against the iron oarlocks as the men fight to alter the massive raft's trajectory, battling the persistent southern pull of the main channel. You grab the long, ashwood-sounding pole from its resting place along the gunwale, stepping quickly to the square bow of the vessel. You plunge the heavy stick into the murky water, feeling for the contour of the riverbed as the flatboat drifts closer to the shadowy shoreline. The wood strikes a soft, yielding layer of mud, sending a dull vibration up your arms that tells you the water here is deep enough to prevent grounding. You pull the dripping pole back aboard, the river water running down the shaft and soaking into the thick leather of your gloves. You call out the depth to the steersman in a low, measured voice, ensuring your words carry over the splash of the sweeps without echoing into the surrounding forest. You ready the pole for another strike, serving as the blind eyes of the raft as it creeps into the darkened cove. Mud yields to a solid ridge of submerged gravel with a harsh, grating scrape that reverberates through the thick oak timbers of the hull. The forward momentum of the heavy flatboat ceases abruptly, the blunt bow wedging itself firmly onto the hidden shelf, just yards from the willow thicket. The sudden deceleration throws the crew forward, forcing men to grab the nearest cargo crate or rope line to maintain their footing on the frost-slicked deck. Water rushes past the stern in a noisy, turbulent swirl, angry at the sudden obstruction placed in its path by the moored vessel. The physical journey of the day officially ends with this jarring impact, trading the kinetic danger of the open river for the static vulnerability of the shoreline. You leap over the wooden rail before the raft has a chance to settle, a thick coil of heavy hemp rope slung securely over your left shoulder. The freezing water of the shallows hits you at mid-thigh, shocking the breath from your lungs and sending a million sharp needles of cold through your tired muscles. You wade toward the tangled roots of the largest willow tree, your boots slipping perilously on the slick algae-covered stones hidden beneath the mud. You ignore the biting chill, focusing entirely on reaching the sturdy trunk before the river current can pull the heavy flatboat back into the channel. You wrap the abrasive hemp around the rough bark, pulling the line taut with a desperate heave that tests the limits of your exhausted back. You watch two other men splash into the water behind you, carrying the stern lines to secure the rear of the clumsy craft against the relentless pull of the Ohio. They work in grim silence, tying intricate, locking knots around the exposed roots of a fallen sycamore, their breath pluming in the cooling twilight air. The heavy ropes pull rigid as iron cables, groaning under the immense strain of holding tons of cargo and timber against the flow of the river. This mooring must withstand not only the natural forces of the water, but the potential chaos of a night storm or a sudden violent boarding attempt. The men double-check every lashing, trusting their lives and their livelihoods to the friction of hemp fibers against damp wood. You trudge back through the clinging mud and haul yourself over the gunwale, your saturated trousers instantly beginning to stiffen in the cold breeze. You shed the wet leather boots and peel the freezing wool from your legs, replacing them with a dry pair of breeches pulled from your canvas duffel. You rub your skin vigorously with a rough linen towel, forcing the circulation to return to your pale, shivering limbs. You know that lingering in wet clothes after the sun has set is a quick path to a fever, a condition that the frontier treats with ruthless finality. You pull a pair of dry knitted socks over your feet, the simple comfort of the warm yawn, feeling like an extraordinary luxury in the harsh environment. The small iron stove at the center of the deck becomes the immediate priority as the last traces of purple light fade from the sky above the bluffs. The young deckhand clears the damp ash from the grate using a bent piece of tin, exposing the cold cast iron beneath to the fresh air. He carefully arranges a handful of dry birch bark shavings, shielding the fragile tinder from the wind with his hunched body as he strikes the flint. Sparks shower downward like tiny dying stars, one finally taking hold in the curled bark and blooming into a tentative yellow flame. He feeds the fire with pencil-thin twigs of dead pine, coaxing the heat upward until the stovepipe begins to radiate a blessed ambient warmth across the forward deck. You step close to the crackling stove, holding your raw, calloused hands out to absorb the initial wave of heat pushing through the iron door. You watch the flames dance and multiply, their orange light casting long, frantic shadows across the stacked barrels and crates surrounding the small encampment. You turn your back to the fire, allowing the warmth to penetrate the thick wool of your coat and soothe the deep, persistent ache in your lower spine. You stare into the heart of the flames, letting the scent of burning wood and the crackle of dry sap anchor your senses in the present reality. You shift your gaze to scan the darkened shoreline, understanding that the fire provides necessary comfort, but also acts as a beacon in the trackless wilderness. A heavy cast iron Dutch oven is dragged onto the heated surface, its blackened bottom scraping loudly against the metal grate. The cook drops a large lump of preserved pork fat into the vessel, the rendering lard hissing and spitting angrily as it melts into a shallow, greasy pool. He adds a sack of dried pinto beans that have been soaking in river water since morning, stirring the heavy mixture with a long carved wooden spoon. The smell of the cooking food is dense and savory, a powerful aroma that causes stomachs to rumble audibly after hours of grueling, unfueled labor. The crew gathers loosely around the stove, their faces illuminated by the underlight of the flames, watching the pot with a singular, hungry focus. You take a seat on an overturned wooden bucket, keeping your flintlock rifle resting easily across your knees as the evening meal simmers. You pull a small, oiled rag from your pouch and begin the meticulous process of wiping down the iron barrel, removing the accumulated moisture of the day. You check the frizzen and the flash pan, ensuring no dampness has compromised the delicate black powder that guarantees the weapon's lethal functionality. You value this mechanical routine, the repetitive motion of cleaning the firearm serving as a calming meditation that settles your fraying nerves. You run your thumb over the sharp edge of the napped flint, feeling the dangerous potential locked within the simple mechanism. The river valley surrenders completely to the night, the darkness achieving a thick, almost physical density that presses inward from the tree line. The chorus of evening insects reaches a deafening crescendo, a vibrating wall of sound that masks the subtle noises of the surrounding woods. An owl calls from the high ridge, a haunting, multi-syllable hoot that echoes off the limestone cliffs and fades slowly down the river corridor. The flatboat is a tiny island of light and human activity suspended in an ocean of ancient, unmapped wilderness. The men speak in hushed, guarded tones, their voices never rising above a low murmur, instinctively recognizing that loud noises do not belong in this hostile, listening environment. You accept a battered tin plate from the cook, the metal hot enough to burn your fingers as he ladles a generous portion of the heavy bean stew. You use a chunk of stale, hardened cornbread to scoop the thick mixture, the taste of salt and iron dominating the unrefined palate of the frontier meal. You chew slowly, extracting every necessary calorie from the dense food, knowing tomorrow will demand the exact same brutal expenditure of physical energy. You keep your eyes fixed on the black wall of the forest beyond the glow of the stove, scanning for the unnatural disruption of a shadow moving against the trees. You eat with your weapon resting against your leg, the reality of the 1790s borderlands requiring a constant state of armed readiness even during the simple act of dining. The wind shifts, blowing straight down the river channel and carrying the distinct muddy scent of decaying leaves and disturbed silt. The sudden breeze forces the stovepipe to draw harder, the fire roaring briefly and sending a shower of bright orange sparks spinning into the dark sky above the mast. The flatboat shifts slightly against its moorings, the heavy timbers groaning as the current tests the strength of the frozen hemp lines tied to the willows. The physical world of the raft is a collection of rough textures and sharp smells, from the coarse wool of the blankets to the metallic tang of the black powder stored in the holds. This is a life stripped of all Eastern comforts, reduced to the elemental struggle of maintaining heat, consuming calories, and avoiding the predators that haunt the shadows. You finish the last bite of your meal and use a handful of river sand to scour the grease from your tin plate, an abrasive cleaning method born of raw necessity. You rinse the metal in the cold water churning past the hull, the icy shock biting at your wrists before you shake the plate dry. You stow your gear in a small wooden box near your pack, keeping your immediate space organized and free of clutter that might cause a stumble in the dark. You understand that discipline in these small matters separates the surviving crews from those whose wrecked boats litter the gravel bars downstream. You pour yourself a measure of tepid water from the drinking barrel, washing away the heavy, salty taste of the preserved pork. The older steersman begins assigning the shifts for the night watch, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that carries easily over the crackling fire. The rotation is a grim lottery, dividing the long hours of darkness into manageable segments of freezing vigilance and tense waiting. He points a calloused finger at you, designating you for the second watch, the difficult stretch that spans the late evening and the approach of midnight. The assignment means you have only a few hours to rest your muscles on the hard, unyielding planks of the deck before standing guard again. The men accept their lots with silent nods, possessing an unspoken understanding that the safety of the entire cargo relies on the unbroken discipline of the individual sentries. You move away from the light of the stove, letting your eyes adjust to the deeper gloom near the stacked crates of iron tools. You unroll a heavy canvas tarp to serve as a barrier against the damp wood, arranging your thick wool blanket to block the creeping wind cutting across the deck. You place your loaded rifle parallel to your leg, ensuring the stock is within immediate grasp should a sudden alarm shatter the quiet of the camp. You sit stiffly on the rough canvas, listening to the gentle, rhythmic lap of the river water against the flat stern of the moored vessel. You draw a slow, deep breath at the cold night air, bracing your mind for the mental endurance required to hold the line during the coming shift. The tales of the Hark brothers circulate silently through your thoughts, a dark mythology built on the very real blood of merchants who underestimated the frontier. These men do not demand a toll or negotiate for the cargo. They simply slaughter the crew and drift the stolen flatboat down to the unpoliced ports of the Deep South. The isolation of the mooring cold amplifies this dread, turning every rustling willow branch into the footfall of an approaching killer. The law of the eastern seaboard holds no jurisdiction here, replaced entirely by the primitive mathematics of survival and the blunt force of the lead ball. The rivermen know that justice is a luxury they cannot afford, relying instead on raw suspicion and a willingness to fire into the shadows. You check the priming pan of your musket one final time, running your thumb over the cold steel to confirm the powder remains dry and loose. You pull the heavy collar of your coat higher against the biting wind, tucking your chin into the rough wool to preserve the fragile heat of your own breath. You watch the first sentry take his position at the bow, a dark, motionless silhouette standing against the faint starlight reflecting off the river. You settle into your waiting position, your muscles taut, and your senses reaching out into the blackness of the Ohio Valley. You sit in absolute silence, a solitary guard in the wooden fortress, waiting for the slow turning of the hours to summon you to the watch. You stand your designated post at the bow, the dense blackness of the river valley wrapping around the moored flatboat like a heavy woolen shroud. Absolute silence presses inward from the wilderness, broken only by the microscopic, rhythmic tapping of a submerged branch against the lower hull planks. The cold radiates upward through the thick leather soles of your boots, a relentless, creeping numbness that tests your physical resolve. You maintain a rigid, unyielding posture, your thumbs resting lightly against the cold iron hammers of your loaded musket, The responsibility of the crew rests heavily upon your shoulders, a silent vow to protect the cargo from the unseen terrors of the frontier. You focus your exhausted eyes on the subtle variations in the darkness, searching for any unnatural movement along the muddy shoreline. You pace a tight, calculated circle around the forward cleats, forcing the sluggish blood to circulate through your stiffening joints as the hours dissolve into a seamless void of freezing temperature. The small iron stove at the center of the deck has burned down to a mere handful of glowing coals, offering no true warmth to the shivering sentries. You listen to the breathing of the sleeping men behind you, an uneven chorus of sighs and exhalations that ground you in the physical reality of the vessel. The river continues its relentless southward flow just a few feet away, a massive, unfeeling force wholly indifferent to the human struggles taking place on its surface. You pull the rough collar of your coat higher over your ears, trapping the meager heat generated by your own breath. Frost begins to ruthlessly reclaim the exposed timber of the deck, forming delicate crystalline patterns across the rough-hewn oak planks. The sharp metallic tang of the freezing air bites at the inside of your nostrils with every inhalation, a constant reminder of the hostile environment. You trace the complex geometry of the nearest cargo crate with your bare fingertips, relying on tactile sensation to anchor your drifting mind. The immense isolation of the Ohio frontier feels particularly absolute in this deep hour, severing all psychological ties to the civilized world left behind in the East. You know that survival depends strictly on the collective discipline of this small, floating community, in the raw iron of the tools you carry. You lean your weight against the sturdy corner post, conserving your depleting energy for the remainder of the shift. Footsteps sound faintly behind you, the deliberate, measured tread of leather on frosted wood breaking the intense stillness of your vigil. The veteran steersman approaches through the gloom, his dark silhouette materializing from the shadows near the central cargo hold. He touches your shoulder with a heavy, calloused hand, a silent, universally understood signal that your specific burden of responsibility has concluded. You lower the heavy barrel of your flintlock rifle, feeling an immense release of tension in your neck and upper back. You offer a brief, grim nod in exchange, acknowledging the seamless transfer of authority that keeps the floating fortress secure. You step away from the freezing bow, surrendering the post to the older rivermen and turning your thoughts toward the desperate need for physical recovery. You navigate the treacherous, ice-coated deck with agonizing deliberation, your muscles trembling in the aftermath of the sustained adrenaline release. The flatboat exists as a maze of stacked barrels and tied-down canvas, a geometry you must traverse strictly by memory in the pitch black. You locate your designated sleeping space near the starboard gunwale, a narrow patch of uneven timber shielded slightly from the wind by a towering crate of iron plows. You unroll a heavy piece of oiled canvas to serve as a moisture barrier against the damp wood, smoothing the stiff fabric with the flat of your hand. You arrange your thick woolen blanket carefully over the tarp, creating a crude but desperately necessary nest against the plummeting temperature. You set your loaded musket down parallel to the makeshift bed, keeping the weapon within immediate reach. You sit heavily onto the prepared canvas, your knee joints popping loudly in the hushed quiet of the sleeping camp. The cold of the deck instantly attempts to penetrate the protective layers, a persistent adversary seeking the vulnerable heat of your exhausted body. You unlace the heavy leather boots with numb, fumbling fingers, pulling the stiff footwear off to allow your constrained feet to finally expand. You massage the aching arches and stiffened toes, working the stagnant blood back into the extremities before the frostbite can take root. You place the boots carefully near the edge of the blanket, ensuring they will be easily found in the event of a sudden, dark emergency. You pull a pair of dry knitted wool socks from your pack, relishing the immediate warmth they provide to your chilled skin. Exhaustion registers deep within the marrow of your bones, a heavy, sinking gravity that makes every deliberate movement feel monumental. You lie back against the hard, unyielding planks, pulling the coarse wool blanket tightly up to your chin to seal out the freezing drafts. You feel the sharp contrast between the freezing air on your face and the building pocket of body heat trapped beneath the heavy fabric. The physical pain of the day's labor asserts itself in a chorus of dull aches, from the raw blisters on your palms to the localized strain in your lower spine. You shift your hips slightly, seeking a marginal improvement in comfort against the unforgiving topography of the deck. You know the wood will not yield, demanding instead that your body adapt to its harsh surface for the brief hours of rest. You listen to the acoustic landscape of the moored flatboat shift as you transition from active sentinel to passive observer. The rhythmic, heavy breathing of the other sleeping men forms a comforting background noise, a collective testament to their survival through another brutal day on the frontier. You hear the resonant groan of the primary het mooring line as the river current attempts to twist the massive raft away from the willow trunks. The sound is a structural complaint, followed instantly by the sloshing of displaced water against the flat stern. You map these sounds meticulously in your mind, cataloging the normal mechanical noises of the vessel to ensure no anomalous disturbances go unnoticed. You allow your eyelids to droop marginally, the sheer weight of fatigue fighting against the ingrained paranoia of the borderlands. Sudden stillness claims the valley as the wind dies away, leaving the Ohio frontier suspended in a state of breathless anticipation. The sharp, acrid scent of the extinguished pine fire lingers heavily in the stagnant air, mixing with the underlying odor of damp earth and decaying riverweed. You open your eyes to stare straight upward, finding the dense canopy of the overhanging willow branches silhouetted starkly against the scattered, icy starlight. The intricate network of bare twigs resembles a shattered pane of glass, fracturing the night sky into thousands of tiny, isolated fragments of space. You feel a profound insignificance beneath that vast celestial dome, a fleeting awareness of your minuscule place within the immense scale of the unmapped continent. You let the philosophical thought drift away, replacing it with the simple, grounded reality of the cold air in your lungs. You adjust the edge of the blanket, tucking a loose corner firmly beneath your shoulder to stop a tiny, invasive draft of freezing air. The rough wool scratches pleasantly against your neck, a tactile reminder of the physical boundary separating you from the hostile environment. You trace the microscopic scuttle of a water beetle navigating the dry timber just inches from your ear, the sound surprisingly loud in the absolute quiet. The river holds 1,000 tiny lives existing independent of the human intrusion, a complex ecosystem carrying on its nocturnal routines. You turn your head toward the center of the deck, checking the dull red glow still emanating from the base of the iron stove. You watch the heat shimmer faintly in the dark, a dying testament to the day's labor and the fragile comfort it provided. Dim starlight reflects off the frost-coated barrel of the musket resting by your side, a cold metallic gleam that underscores the violent potential of the frontier. You rest your right hand lightly on the wooden stock, the familiar shape offering a psychological security that no thick blanket can provide. The outlaws hiding in the limestone caves and the predators stalking the shoreline remain a constant theoretical threat, but the immediate reality is the overwhelming demand for sleep. You understand that physical recovery is just as crucial to survival as a sharp flint and dry powder, requiring a deliberate surrender of your hypervigilance. You command your tense muscles to unlock, starting with the tight knots in your shoulders and moving down the length of your exhausted spine. You feel the physical resistance melting away, leaving a heavy, grounded sensation in its wake. You trace the measured, creeping advance of the frost across the neighboring cargo crate, the white crystals forming an advancing front line against the dark wood. The temperature continues its downward plunge, finding the absolute bottom of the night in these silent pre-dawn hours. You feel an involuntary shiver rack your torso, the body's final, desperate attempt to generate internal heat before succumbing to the resting state. You pull your knees up slightly towards your chest, curling into a tighter, more heat-efficient posture beneath the heavy wool. You breathe through your nose to warm the freezing air before it hits your lungs, establishing a deliberate metronomic cadence that matches the rocking of the moored flatboat. You take comfort in the scent of the cargo hold rising from the deck planks beneath you, a complex olfactory history of the merchant expedition. You detect the sweet dust of the Pittsburgh flour, the sharp brine of the preserved pork, and the metallic tang of the stacked iron plows waiting to break the western soil. These smells form the invisible architecture of your floating world, a sensory map that requires no light to interpret. You take comfort in the solidity of the goods, the tangible proof of human enterprise, persisting in the face of the wild, untamed continent. You push the anticipation of future labor away, narrowing your focus exclusively to the present, quiet moment of recovery. You hear a sudden, sharp crack from the deep forest on the eastern bank, the unmistakable sound of a heavy, frost-brittle branch snapping under the weight of a nocturnal predator. The noise echoes briefly against the limestone bluffs before being swallowed by the immense acoustic dampening of the wilderness. Your eyes snap open, the ingrained survival instinct momentarily overriding the heavy pull of exhaustion, your fingers tightening reflexively around the stock of the musket. You hold your breath, straining to hear the follow-up sound of a footfall or a disturbed thicket that would indicate a human presence. The silence rushes back in to fill the void, unbroken and absolute, confirming that the disturbance was merely the natural machinery of the woods. You release a breath, your heart rate decelerating as the false alarm fades into the background. You loosen your grip on the weapon, the adrenaline spike leaving a residual, hollow ache in your chest as it dissipates. The sheer mental exhaustion of the constant paranoia proves more draining than the physical labor of the sweeping oars. You close your eyes again, determining to ignore any further distant noises that do not directly impact the immediate security of the flatboat. You visualize the relentless flow of the river water passing just inches beneath your resting body, a massive kinetic force that never pauses for rest or reflection. You feel the boundaries of your own fatigue blurring, the sharp edges of the day's pain melting into a generalized, heavy lethargy. Ambient dampness equalizes with the heat trapped beneath your blanket, establishing a fragile thermal equilibrium that allows the muscles to completely relax. You feel the precise weight of the heavy wool pressing down on your chest, a solid, comforting pressure that restricts your breathing into a measured cadence. The precise, brittle snap of a single pine needle combusting in the dying embers of the stove punctuates the silence. You notice the metallic scent of the cold iron tools stacked in the crate beside your head. The rhythmic creak of the willow trunk, taking the strain of the mooring line, vibrates faintly through the deck planks and into your shoulder blade. You focus entirely on the microsensory details of the failing night, abandoning all thought of the journey ahead or the miles left behind. The specific dry scrape of a dead leaf blowing across the frosted canvas tarp draws your attention for a fleeting second. You detect the sharp ozone smell of the frost expanding into the microscopic cracks of the oak hull. The settling groan of a flour barrel shifting a fraction of an inch under its own immense weight resonates through the wood. You feel the sudden, microscopic drop in air pressure that signals the very beginning of the atmospheric shift toward dawn. You surrender the final remnants of your vigilance to the absolute stillness of the frozen river valley. Powdery scents of crushed dry river reeds drift over the gunwale on a nearly imperceptible current of air. You feel the exact texture of the coarse wool fibers scratching against the sensitive skin of your left cheek. Deep, heavy thuds of a submerged log striking the mudbank 50 yards downstream register as a dull vibration rather than a sound. You notice the exact moment the dull red glow from the stove finally succumbs to the ash, leaving the deck in total, uncompromising blackness. The chilling, absolute silence of the frontier winter finalizes its grip on the wooden raft. The sharp, crystalline scrape of fresh ice forming along the iron edge of the bow cleat echoes faintly in the frozen dark. You close your eyes. Rest well tonight, for the river keeps its story safe until you are ready to visit again.